Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I woke up because the room felt wrong. Not cold, not loud, just wrong, like I'd been dreaming with my eyes open. The first thing I noticed was my phone lying on my chest, screen glowing faintly. I never fall asleep with it in bed. I usually plug it in across the room so I don't doom scroll half the night, but there it was, warm against my shirt like it had been on for a while. When I picked it up, the camera app was open, front facing. I blinked a few times, trying to piece together if I'd accidentally grabbed it in my sleep, but the position didn't make sense. It wasn't under my hand or near the pillow. It was centered on my chest like someone had set it there. I hit the gallery button. Gallery button. There was a new photo from 3:17 a.m. It wasn't of me or the bed. It was angled upward, toward the ceiling in the far corner of my room. The image wasn't bright, but in the corner near the molding was a small, hazy glow. Not a reflection or light leak, just a faint, round patch of pale white, maybe the size of a tennis ball. I stared at it, waiting for something in the image to click. Maybe a car passing outside had cast light through the blinds. Maybe my clock display had reflected off something, but nothing matched the angle. The glow floated in empty air. I lowered the phone and looked at the ceiling. Nothing. Just the usual shadows cast by the streetlight through the blinds. I checked the time, 3:24 a.m. Only 7 minutes had passed since the photo was taken. I sat up slowly, listening to the quiet. My house in Rio Vista was usually alive with small sounds, AC humming, the fridge clicking, pipes settling, but that night everything felt muted, like the walls were thicker. I took another look at the photo, zooming in until the pixels blurred. The glow didn't have edges. It didn't brighten anything around it. It was almost like fog, but fog doesn't hang in perfect round patches indoors. I turned the camera to the same corner and aimed the phone. Nothing showed, just the beige ceiling and a darker patch where the walls met. I got out of bed, my legs prickling with that half-asleep numbness, and walked to the corner. I reached up and touched the ceiling. Cool, solid, normal. No drafts, no warmth, no discoloration. When I stepped back, the floor creaked under me, an ordinary sound, but in that silence, it felt too loud. I checked the rest of the house. The hall was dark. The bathroom door was half open the way I'd left it. The kitchen light I usually kept on as a nightlight was flickering very slightly, like the bulb was struggling. I flipped the switch off, then on again. The flicker stopped, but the quiet didn't. Back in the bedroom, I sat at the edge of the bed and tried to remember my dream, if I'd even been dreaming before waking up. All I could recall was a pressure on my chest, something heavy or warm. I'd chalked it up to my blanket bunching up, but the more I thought about it, the more it didn't line up. I went into my phone settings to check the battery usage. Sure enough, the camera app had been running for 7 minutes. The photo was taken at the beginning of that. Something had woken the phone, unlocked it, opened the camera, and taken a picture. The unlock logs showed it had recognized my face, except my face wasn't in the frame. I tried to laugh at myself, but it came out shaky. I put the phone screen down on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. When I lay back down, the room felt heavier than before. I tried breathing through it, telling myself it was nothing, just a glitch. Maybe my face had partially triggered the sensor somehow. I almost fell asleep again when something in the hallway made a soft tapping sound. Not a footstep, not a pipe, more like a fingertip brushing the wall. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then another tap, slightly closer, like it was near the doorframe now. I reached over and grabbed the phone, turning on the screen. The sudden light felt blinding. My finger hovered over the flashlight icon, but I didn't tap it yet. I strained to hear anything in the hallway, but the silence after those taps was so complete it felt intentional. I slid quietly out of bed and walked to the door. The floorboards groaned under me. When I pulled the door open, the hallway looked ordinary. Dim light from the street lamp slipping through the living room blinds, everything still. I flicked on the hall light. The brightness didn't reveal anything, but it made something else obvious. The air in that hallway felt ever so slightly warmer, like someone had been standing there not long before. I checked every room, living room, kitchen, bathroom, pantry, nothing. But the longer I stood there, the more a faint ringing started building in my ears, like the hum of electronics, except I couldn't find the source. I went back to the bedroom. The ringing faded when I stepped inside, replaced by that thick quiet again. I grabbed the phone from the nightstand. The camera app was open again. I hadn't touched it. The lens was facing outward, like someone had been holding the phone and lowering it just before I picked it up. The screen showed black, my hand covering it when I grabbed the phone, but the open app wasn't from muscle memory. I knew I hadn't opened it. My thumb trembled a little as I backed out of the camera and returned to the gallery. A second new photo had appeared, taken at 3:31 a.m. The angle was different from the first. This one was angled slightly downward toward my bed. It showed the mattress, the blanket, the shadow of my head on the pillow, taken from maybe 5 or 6 feet away, like someone had stood at the foot of the bed holding the phone. I hadn't been out of bed at 3:31, and my phone had been on the nightstand. There was nothing unusual in the photo except for one thing. The same faint glow from the first image was visible again, this time near the right side of the frame, as if it had drifted across the room. I dropped the phone onto the blanket and backed up until I hit the wall. My breathing sounded too loud. The rest of the room was silent. My first instinct was to leave. Just grab my keys, walk outside, sit in the truck until sunrise. But stepping into that hallway again felt like stepping into a space where something had already been. Instead, I switched on every light in the room, all 3 lamps and the overhead. The shadows dissolved, but the tension didn't. I picked the phone back up, forcing myself to zoom in on the second photo. The glow looked more defined. Not a shape exactly, just a sharper boundary. I could almost make out a gradient, like it had depth. I backed out of the photo and checked the camera again. I didn't take another picture, but I pointed the lens at the same corner where the glow had appeared. Nothing. Then the phone vibrated in my hand. No notification, no call, just a single buzz like the kind you get when a device recognizes your face. Except the screen was already on, already active, and I wasn't holding it in front of me. I lowered the phone slowly. The buzzing stopped. I stood there for a long time, too afraid to turn off the lights, too afraid to lie back down. Sometime near dawn, the exhaustion finally hit hard enough that I sat at the foot of the bed with my back to the wall, phone in hand, eyes half open. No new photos appeared. No hum returned. No tapping. When the sun came through the blinds, the house felt normal again. The fridge clicked on. A neighbor's car started outside. The birds were loud. I checked the photos in daylight to make sure I hadn't imagined anything. Both were still there. Both showed the glow. I deleted them, not because I thought it would help, but because I didn't want to look at them anymore. But sometimes late at night, when the house is too quiet, I wake up and check my phone right away without even thinking, just to make sure the camera isn't open and that there aren't any new photos I don't remember taking. I noticed the light maybe 10 minutes into my walk. It was late, close to midnight, and the neighborhood was quiet in the way small Colorado towns get on weeknights, especially when the weather is turning cold. A thin layer of fog sat low over the ground, not enough to hide anything, but enough to soften the streetlights and blur the edges of things. I'd gone out because I couldn't sleep, and figured a slow walk through the trails behind my street might calm me down. I was cutting along the path behind the old elementary school when something bright caught my eye through the trees. At first, I thought it was the moon coming out from behind a cloud, but the moon was behind me, and this light was moving. It floated just above the tree line, maybe 20 or 30 feet up. A single white point, steady and soft, not blinking like a plane or dipping like a drone. It drifted at a slow, even pace, parallel to the trail I was on. I kept walking, expecting it to pass behind the pines and disappear, but it stayed with me, matching my speed. Not racing, not weaving, just drifting in line with my steps. When I stopped, the light stopped. It froze mid-drift so suddenly I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. I stood there for several seconds waiting for it to continue on its original path, but it stayed perfectly still, like it was anchored to the air. I took a single step forward. It moved again. Same slow pace, same slight downward tilt, same subtle gliding motion, almost like a lantern moving on an invisible track. My throat tightened. I stood still again. The light stopped instantly. I backed up one step. The gravel crunched under my shoe. The light didn't move this time, but the brightness changed by the smallest amount, like it pulsed once, softer than a heartbeat. I told myself it had to be a drone, someone messing around, something with a stabilization issue that made it pause whenever I paused. But drones buzz, and this thing made absolutely no sound. The woods were silent except for the fog settling and a distant dog barking somewhere back toward town. I forced myself to keep walking. The light moved with me again, staying the same distance away. I tested it more deliberately, walked faster, walked slower, stopped mid-step, sped up again. The light mirrored all of it, like it was tethered to me by an invisible string. The trail curved left toward the creek, and I followed it. The light followed too, adjusting its angles so smoothly it made my stomach twist. Whatever it wasn't following the trail, it was following me. The farther I went, the heavier the air felt. Not wetter or colder, just heavier, like the atmosphere carried weight. Each breath felt slightly pressurized. I started hearing faint buzzing in my ears, like the static you get when your phone is about to lose service. Except my phone had no signal on this part of the trail anyway. Never did. I finally stepped off the gravel path and onto the dirt, heading down toward the small footbridge. The trees thickened around me, and the fog pooled heavier in the low spots. I heard the creek before I saw it, soft water moving around rocks, steady and quiet. The light didn't follow me into the denser trees. It hovered just above them, staying in the gap between two tall pines, bright enough to glow through the branches, but never dipping below their height. When I reached the bridge, I stopped again. My breath clouded in the cold air, drifting upward slightly before fading. I watched the light through the dark branches. It froze again. I took another step forward. The wood planks creaked under my weight. The light pulsed dimly, just once. I couldn't explain why, but something about that soft pulse terrified me more than the following. It felt deliberate. Not a malfunction, not a glitch. It felt like a response. I turned around and headed back toward the trail, walking faster now. The light followed immediately, gliding sideways through the gaps in the branches, matching my speed as if pulled along by invisible rails. I didn't run. Running felt like the worst thing I could do. Instead, I sped up to a brisk walk, breathing through my nose, focusing on the rhythm of my steps. 100 feet later, the trees opened up again, and the light had a clear line of sight. It drifted closer, not by much, maybe 10 feet, but enough that I felt the pressure in the air spike. The buzzing in my ears grew louder, but only in short bursts, like tiny electrical pops inside my head. I stopped again without meaning to. The light froze instantly. It hung there, bright and perfectly still. I don't know how long I stood locked in place. When I finally forced myself to move, I stepped sideways instead of forward, just to see what it would do. The light shifted sideways too, not smoothly, more like a correction, a small adjustment, as if it were aligning itself with me. Something snapped in me then, the realization that whatever it wasn't just tracking location, it was tracking position, orientation, tiny movements. I turned back toward the way home and walked faster. The trail felt narrower than before, and the fog was thickening enough to blur the ground. I kept glancing up to monitor the light, but at some point I realized I didn't need to. It stayed directly above the tree line no matter how much the path wound. Always the same distance, always the same speed. When I reached the clearing near the schoolyard, the light drifted farther back for the first time. Not much, but enough to notice. The buzzing in my ears softened. The air pressure eased slightly. I slowed down. The light slowed too. But then something happened I didn't expect. It dipped lower. Only by a few feet, but enough that the glow brightened the tops of the shorter trees. It wasn't harsh, but the quality of the brightness changed. It sharpened, almost like the edges grew clearer. I froze. The light froze. I took one shaky breath and stepped backward toward the open field. That field looked huge and exposed and terrible to walk into, but every part of me wanted distance from the tree line. The light stayed still. That was the only thing that made me brave enough to keep moving. Step backward, step backward, step backward. Eyes locked on the thing waiting at the edge of the woods. When my feet finally hit the short grass of the open field, I turned and walked forward without stopping. My steps quickened on their own. I could feel the fog thinning as the field opened up around me. My ears rang again, sharper this time, like a pressure valve snapping shut. I risked one last glance over my shoulder. The light had lifted higher, back above the pines. It didn't follow me into the open. It hovered motionless over the highest branches, brightness pulsing once in that same subtle, deliberate way. Then it faded, not out of sight, out of existence. The glow softened until it blended perfectly into the night sky. The pressure released all at once. My ears popped. The air filled with sound again. Distant cars on the highway, a dog barking somewhere near the cluster of houses behind the school. I didn't stop walking until I reached my driveway. Even then, I stood there for a long time, staring up at the sky, waiting to see that point of light return. It didn't, but sometimes when I'm out late and the trees ahead of me look too still, I move one step forward just to see if anything above them moves with me. I was lying in bed when the humming started. It wasn't loud, not something you'd hear through a wall or pick up on a recording. It felt more like pressure, like someone had set a vibrating phone on the mattress near my feet. A deep, steady hum that didn't seem connected to any real sound. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling fan, half convinced it had turned itself on, but the blades were still and the pull chain wasn't moving. The hum spread slowly up my spine until it settled behind my ears. That was the strangest part, not the noise itself, but the way it felt like it existed inside my head instead of outside the room. I sat up, pushing the covers off, expecting to hear something obvious once I changed position. But the hum stayed exactly the same, even though my ears shifted angles. I checked the clock, 2:14 a.m. Nothing else in the house made a sound. No fridge hum, no AC clicking on, no cars out on the street. The silence felt padded, like the whole neighborhood was wrapped in insulation. The hum kept deepening in small increments, almost pulsing. Every few seconds, it pushed outward like a wave and then retreated. I pressed my hands against the mattress, thinking maybe something mechanical under the house was vibrating the frame, but the bed wasn't shaking. The floor wasn't shaking. Only I was. After about a minute, it intensified enough that my heartbeat synced with it, beating in this weird, staggered rhythm I couldn't control. "Okay," I whispered, even though talking didn't help. "What is this?" I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and stood. The hum didn't follow my movement. It stayed in place, right where I'd been lying. That made my stomach flip. I stepped closer to the foot of the bed, and the humming came back, blooming inside my skull again as soon as I got within maybe 2 feet of where my head had been on the pillow. I backed away fast. The hum weakened with distance. It wasn't coming from the house. It wasn't coming from any appliance. It was tied to a specific spot in the air. I grabbed a sweatshirt from the chair in the corner and pulled it on, just to feel like I was doing something. When I looked back at the bed, the hum changed. Not louder, not darker, not anything obvious. It just shifted, almost like it noticed I was paying attention. My ears popped. Then the hum cut off, instantly. The silence that followed smacked into me so hard I sat back on the bed. I didn't realize how much the humming had filled the room until it vanished. My ears rang in the way they do after a concert, except I hadn't heard anything loud. The ringing grew sharper over the next few seconds, spreading across my inner ears like pain. When it faded, the silence left behind felt wrong. Not peaceful. Empty. I turned on the lamp. The light flickered once, just once, and steadied. Shadows looked sharper than they should have, especially around the doorframe. For a moment, I thought something might be standing outside the bedroom, but when I walked over and looked into the hallway, it was just darkness and the faint nightlight near the bathroom. Still, the hallway felt off. Too still. I could usually hear the neighbor's dog through the shared wall or the old pipes settling. Nothing. I walked to the living room, bare feet cold on the hardwood. I stood there, listening, waiting for some normal sound. The digital clock on the microwave should have been blinking its numbers in that soft electric chirp, but even that seemed quieter. When I checked the front window, the street looked normal. 3 parked cars, porch lights across the way, trees moving slightly in a breeze I couldn't hear. The quiet pressed against the glass like weight. Then, faintly, something changed. A vibration, not loud enough to be a sound. not physical enough to shake anything, brushed across the room like a ripple of warm air. It came from above, from somewhere the attic space I never used. My head snapped up instinctively. Nothing moved. No creaking beams, no footsteps. Nothing. But I felt watched in a way that didn't feel like paranoia. It was directional, focused. I stepped backward until my calves hit the couch. Another ripple moved through the space. Light, almost curious. My breath shortened again. I wanted to tell myself it was my nerves, but nerves don't make the air feel thicker in one specific corner of a room. They don't make the shadows shift slightly, even when the lamp isn't flickering. When the vibration faded, the silence rushed back in stronger than before. My ears rang again, harder this time, like pressure was equalizing after something had been blocking it. I went back to my bedroom because the rest of the house felt too exposed. I shut the door, not locked, just shut, and sat on the bed with my back against the headboard. The lamp was still on. The sweatshirt I'd thrown on felt too warm, but I didn't take it off. The hum hadn't returned, but the lingering sensation remained. Like something had been close enough to touch, but hadn't. I stayed there for what felt like 15 minutes before checking the clock again. Only 4 minutes had passed. I hadn't lost time. I hadn't blacked out. I'd just been sitting there, breathing quietly, waiting for something else to happen. Around 2:30, I heard a soft tap on the window. Not a knock, not a branch, more like the sound of a fingertip brushing the glass. I froze, staring at the curtains. The tap didn't repeat, but the air near the window shifted, bending in a way I could feel more than hear. I didn't move closer. I just watched. A dim patch of light, barely brighter than the dark outside, drifted across the fabric of the curtains like something passing in front of a street lamp. Except there was no street lamp near that side of the house. The nearest one was at the corner. The dim glow lingered for maybe a second, then faded. My chest tightened. I turned off the lamp just to let my eyes adjust to the dark. Sometimes light can make shadows look stranger, and I needed to see what was real and what wasn't. In the dark, the window looked normal. No shapes, no glow, no movement. The silence, though, that same too empty quiet, held steady. I lay down because sitting up made my muscles hurt. My ears rang faintly again, like the hum was trying to restart but couldn't. I watched the ceiling for a long time, waiting for a flicker of movement. I wasn't sure when I finally fell asleep, but the night stretched longer than it usually did. Every small sound, a car passing outside, the fridge kicking on hours later, jerked me awake. When morning finally came, the house felt normal again. Not just quiet, normal. The fridge hummed, the heater clicked, a neighbor's kid yelled outside. My ears didn't ring anymore. Still, when I went back to the bedroom that night, the first thing I did, without thinking, was stand in the doorway and listen for that low hum, that physical vibration that felt like it was aimed at me. It didn't return. But, sometimes lying in the same spot on the mattress, I feel a faint pressure behind my ears, just enough to make me hold my breath for a second before the silence settles in again, too deep to feel natural. I noticed the change in the night before I noticed anything else. I was halfway down County Road 14, the same two-lane stretch I'd driven 100 times between my place and my friend Eli's. It was a little after 11 p.m., cool for early September, with a thin mist drifting low over the ditches. Nothing unusual. The truck hummed along, radio low, windows cracked just enough to let in the smell of damp fields. Then the darkness brightened, not like headlights coming over a hill or a town glow in the distance. It was more like someone had turned the whole night up a shade. The trees, the road, the signs, everything looked slightly clearer, as if the blackness had thinned. No harsh light source, no beam, just a soft, uniform brightening that lasted 3, maybe 4 seconds. I slowed down automatically. The brightness wasn't enough to see color, but it was enough to make my dashboard lighting look unnecessary. The hairs on my arms stood up, even though the air pouring in through the window felt the same as before. Then it vanished, just snapped back to normal darkness. My eyes struggled to readjust. The road looked deeper somehow, like I'd stepped into a darker room. I blinked a few times, gripping the wheel tighter. The radio buzzed with static for half a second, then steadied. That was when I noticed I'd already passed the turnoff for Miller Bridge. I knew exactly where it should have been. A reflective sign on the right, half rusted, the driveway curving toward the old farm. It wasn't a turn you could miss unless you were texting or dead tired, and I was neither. But I was already a good quarter-mile past it, the road stretching on ahead like nothing had happened. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. The mist curled around the tires. No cars passed in either direction. I checked the time, 11:18. That felt wrong somehow, but I couldn't place why. I put the truck in reverse, backed up slowly, and kept watching the right side through the mirror. No sign, no driveway, just a long, continuous line of fencing and dark trees behind it. I drove forward again, checking the left side this time, even though I knew the turn wasn't on that side. Still nothing. I started to question my own memory. Maybe I'd mixed up landmarks. Maybe the mist threw me off. Maybe the brightness had messed with my depth perception. I drove another half-mile, feeling more and more uneasy as the road stretched on without any familiar breaks. This wasn't a long section. There should have been a second farmhouse, the one with the collapsed barn, but I didn't see it anywhere. Then the brightness returned. Not as long this time, maybe 2 seconds, but brighter. The mist glowed faintly, like it was lit from within, and the asphalt reflected more than my headlights should have allowed. I braked without meaning to, heart kicking hard at my ribs. The brightness faded again. When it did, the road ahead bent in a direction it shouldn't have. County Road 14 didn't curve for another mile, but the pavement in front of me dipped gently to the left before straightening out again. I slowed to a crawl, leaning forward over the wheel. There were no new signs, no construction markers, no fresh gravel, just a curve I'd never seen before. My chest tightened with the sense that I shouldn't be where I was, even though I hadn't turned once since leaving Eli's. I kept driving, too afraid to stop, too afraid to turn around in case something was behind me. About a minute later, the road straightened and I recognized a stretch of trees again, familiar pine silhouettes, a broken fence post, the mailbox painted with the name Larson, the letters peeling. Relief hit me so hard I laughed out loud. I wasn't lost, I wasn't losing my mind. But then I passed the mailbox and the brightness hit a third time. This one didn't brighten the whole night, just the edges. The treetops lit up faintly, like moonlight catching them, even though the moon hadn't risen yet. The ditches glowed a soft haze, the road texture sharpened. I felt watched, though I didn't know from where. I looked up at the sky, empty. No moon, no stars, just thick cloud cover. When I looked back at the road, the brightness was already fading. I exhaled shakily and kept going, reminding myself I was only 10 minutes from home, just a few more miles. The road settled into the familiar long straightaway, and the mist thinned. My shoulders started to relax. Then something changed in the air inside the cab. Not the smell, not the temperature, the pressure. My ears popped like I'd driven up a steep grade, even though the land was flat. The truck engine didn't sound right either. It had a hollow, distant tone like I was hearing it through foam. I tapped the gas. The engine responded normally, but the sound stayed wrong. In the corner of my eye, something flickered through the trees to the right. A dim flash, gone before I turned my head. The brightness again, but contained this time, localized. I slowed down, scanning the tree line. Another flicker, higher up, about 20 feet off the ground. I stopped the truck completely. The moment I did, the night brightened again, but only in a narrow vertical strip between the trees. A soft, pale column of light, wide as a person, but stretching up into the branches without lighting them fully. The mist drifted through it like steam. I stared at it, hands clamped on the wheel, pulse hammering. The column flickered once, then shrank slightly like it was adjusting. Then it blinked out. Instant. The darkness snapped back so fast I gasped. My headlights suddenly looked too bright again. I put the truck in drive and pressed the accelerator harder than I meant to. The wheels spat gravel before gripping asphalt, and I took off down the road, the engine roaring back to its normal sound. The mist thinned even more the farther I went, like I was leaving something behind. When I reached my driveway, I sat in the truck for a minute before getting out. The night looked normal, cool, quiet, no strange brightness, no flickers between the trees. Inside, I checked the clock on the stove, 11:33. That wasn't possible. The drive from where I'd stopped should have taken at least 10 minutes. I'd left the place where the road bent out of nowhere at around 11:22. I walked from room to room, turning on lights, listening for anything unusual. The house felt normal. My phone buzzed once with a weather alert. Everything seemed completely ordinary. But when I went to bed and closed my eyes, the memory of the brightness kept replaying. That washed out thinning of the night. The curve in the road that shouldn't have been there. The column of pale light flickering like it was searching. Around 2 a.m., I got up to drink water. When I looked out the kitchen window, the woods across the road were dark, except for a faint, narrow brightness lingering between the trunks, gone before I could focus on it. It hasn't happened again on that road. But sometimes, when I'm driving home late and everything looks normal, the night brightens for half a second. Just enough to make me think the darkness is wearing thin again, and something's waiting behind it. I was stargazing behind my cousin Jonah's cabin the night it happened. He lived out in the hills near Pinedale, Wyoming, where the sky actually looked the way it does in planetarium posters. Huge, sharp, crowded with stars you never see in town. He'd invited a few of us up for the weekend because the Perseid meteor shower was supposed to peak, and he wanted company. I drove up late after work, figuring I'd miss most of the show, but still get a quiet night out of it. By the time I got there, it was close to 11. Jonah and his girlfriend Ariana were already out in the field with blankets and a little speaker playing something low and calm. The weather was clearer than the forecast said it would be, cold but not biting, with the faintest breeze coming down from the ridge. The field behind the cabin sloped gently upward, giving you a wide stretch of open sky. We all lay there on our backs, and I pointing out satellites and the occasional streak of a meteor. It started when I noticed a cluster of stars near Cassiopeia that looked a little off, not brighter or dimmer, just positioned strangely, like one had slipped slightly out of place. I blinked a few times. The stars around it stayed fixed, the constellations perfectly normal, but that one star was drifting, slowly, almost imperceptibly, sliding sideways along a path that didn't match anything I knew. Not a satellite arc, not a plane, not a shooting star. It looked like a star being nudged on a track. I propped myself onto my elbows, trying to follow its movement. The longer I watched, the more certain I was. This thing was moving. Maybe an inch at a time if you held up a hand to measure. "Hey," I said quietly, not wanting to sound weird, "does that star look like it's moving to you?" Jonah didn't answer at first. He was half asleep on his blanket. Ariana turned her head and squinted up at the sky. "Which one?" I pointed directly at it. The star froze. It stopped so abruptly I thought my eyes had tricked me. It sat perfectly still, indistinguishable from every other point of light. The moment Ariana followed my finger, there was no movement. Nothing strange, just a normal sky. I let my hand fall. "Never mind. I think I'm just tired." Ariana shrugged and lay back down. Jonah mumbled something about grabbing another beer and wandered inside. I stayed upright, watching that same patch of sky. And after about 10 seconds, the star started moving again. A fraction at a time. A patient, deliberate glide, like it wasn't trying to hide so much as avoid being seen in motion. My mouth went dry. I waited another minute to be sure, then called out again, "Ariana, look, now it's moving." She sat up with a sigh. "Which one? You gotta show me." I pointed. And again, instant stillness. No drifting, no sliding, no movement at all. A strange pressure settled into my chest, something like embarrassment mixed with a creeping sense that the timing wasn't a coincidence. The moment someone else looked, it stopped. I tried a third time. I waited until Jonah came back out with beers, gave it another 15 seconds until the star was unmistakably drifting again, then said, "You guys gotta see this. That one's shifting." Both of them looked up. I pointed. "Frozen." Jonah stared for a second, shrugged, and handed me a beer. "Man, you're just tired. Stars don't move sideways." I forced a laugh, but couldn't stop watching. When they went back to their conversation, the drifting resumed. Only this time, the star shifted downward, a subtle diagonal slide. Not fast, just steady, like something testing boundaries. Ariana eventually headed inside to make tea, and Jonah went with her, leaving me alone in the field. I lay back down and fixed my eyes on the drifting star. I didn't blink for long stretches because every time I did, I feared I'd miss something. The movement grew slightly more noticeable. Still subtle, but steady enough that if I focused on another star beside it, I could track the difference. The drifting star crossed a gap between two faint stars and kept going. The space behind it didn't change. No afterglow, no streak, no trail. Just quiet, patient movement. I whispered, "What are you doing?" I hadn't meant to say anything out loud. The words slipped out because the silence was thick and the night felt like it was waiting for something from me. The star dimmed. Not by much, just a small pulse like a dying flashlight bulb. Then it brightened again, gradually returning to its normal intensity. I sat up. "Okay," I murmured. "That's not normal." And then, this part is what stuck with me more than the movement. The drifting star paused for the first time without me pointing at it. It hung there, faintly brighter than before. A prickling sensation spread across my arms. I felt exposed out there in the open, even though logically nothing around me had changed. The breeze had stopped. The cold felt sharper. And then the star resumed drifting, but now in a direction that made even less sense. Upward, against the natural arc of the sky, not rising like the rest of the stars, just climbing. A tiny climb, a careful shift. I stood up. When I broke eye contact for just 1 second, just long enough to brush dirt from my jeans, the star brightened again. A flash, brief but sharp. I froze. My heart felt lodged up in my throat. "Jonah!" I shouted. He slid open the back door and squinted at me. "What?" "Just come out here, please." He sighed but stepped onto the porch. "What now?" I pointed at the sky without speaking. The star locked into place instantly. Jonah stared. "Which one am I?" And before he finished the sentence, the star went dimmer, just slightly, like a fading bulb. He frowned. "That one? It's just twinkling." "No," I said, "it's been moving, sliding." "Stars don't slide," he said gently. I lowered my hand and stared again. The star remained perfectly still, but I felt watched, not stared at emotionally, more like someone calculating distance, measuring, waiting. Jonah gave me a weird look, but eventually went back inside, murmuring something about me needing sleep. I stayed alone in the field. When I looked back up, the star didn't drift right away. It waited. 10 seconds. 15. 20. Then it slid again, but this time much faster. Not fast enough to streak, but fast enough that I muttered, "Holy shit," under my breath when I saw it cross a visible distance. It moved toward another cluster of stars, then stopped dead. Then the sky brightened, not a flash, not a beam, just a brief thinning of the darkness in a small circle around that point. And everything in me screamed that something was about to happen. I stepped backward, my boots crunching in the dry grass. The drifting star pulsed faintly a third time. Then it faded. Not out of sight, out of existence, like something had turned off a light behind a tiny pinhole. The sky where it had been looked too empty, like there should have been a star there, but there wasn't. I waited for it to reappear. It didn't. 10 seconds. Nothing. 30. Nothing. A full minute. Nothing. When I finally tore my eyes away, I walked backward all the way to the cabin, unable to shake the feeling that if I looked up again too quickly, I would see the star above me instead of where it had been. Inside, I tried to explain it to Jonah and Ariana. Neither of them had seen anything unusual. They brushed it off as eye strain. Maybe one of those floaters you get when you stare too long at something bright. I didn't argue. It wouldn't have mattered. When we all went to bed, I lay awake for hours, staring out the small window near the bunk beds. Most of the stars looked normal, but every now and then when my eyes drifted away from a particular spot, I thought I saw a faint glimmer of movement in the corner of my vision, like something shifting just out of sight. And each time I looked straight at it, it stopped. The fog was thick enough that my headlights felt useless. It wasn't the drifting kind that moves like smoke. It was the heavy, static kind that sits in place and swallows everything outside the windshield. I was driving back from my friend Marcy's place in Pacific Grove, taking the coastal highway later than I should have. It was close to 1 a.m., and the air was cold enough that my breath fogged the cabin every time I exhaled too hard. I'd driven this stretch of road hundreds of times, curves, cliffs, guardrails, all muscle memory. But that night, the fog made everything feel unfamiliar. Shapes appeared out of nowhere and vanished before I reached them. The white lines seemed to float instead of sit on asphalt. Even the sound of the engine felt muffled. About 10 miles south of town, the fog shifted. Not cleared, shifted. The density dipped for a moment, like something passed through it or stirred it from inside. I slowed to around 30 miles per hour and leaned forward over the wheel. Through the haze, maybe 100 feet ahead, I saw a shadow, At first, I thought it was a tree limb hanging low across the road, or some construction equipment accidentally left behind. But the shape didn't match anything solid I recognized. It hung above the road, maybe 15 feet up, just a dark mass suspended in the fog, perfectly still. I eased off the gas. The road was empty in both directions. No lights, no houses, just 2 lanes of asphalt carved along the coastline with cliffs on one side and forest on the other. The shape didn't move. The closer I got, the darker it looked. Not black, exactly. More like an absence of light, like the fog itself was bending around it. It didn't reflect my headlights. It didn't cast a shadow. It just hovered, blocking the faint gray glow of the sky above. My first instinct was to stop, but something about the stillness of it made stopping feel worse. So I kept rolling forward, barely creeping now, tires crunching softly on the uneven pavement. My heart was beating way too hard for how slow the truck was moving. Every breath felt shallow. I remember gripping the wheel tighter without realizing it. When I reached the exact spot where the shape had been hovering, the fog cleared. Instantly. Not gradually. Not thinning. It was like someone flipped a switch. 1 second I was driving through dense white haze, and the next the air around me was perfectly clear. I could see the trees, the cliff edge, the sky. Stars even, faint ones, but visible. And the shape was gone. There was no sign anything had ever been there. No branches, no debris, nothing disturbed on the road. I slowed to a stop anyway and rolled down the window. The air was completely still. No wind, no surf noise from below, even though I knew the cliffs dropped to the ocean on the west side. Everything felt paused. Then, behind me, the fog closed again. I watched it through the rearview mirror, like a wall pulling itself back together. Dense, pale, completely opaque. I looked forward. Clear. I stepped on the gas again, moving slowly, unable to shake the feeling I was being funneled through some corridor created by whatever I just passed. My hands were shaking now. Not violently, but enough that I noticed. For about a mile, the road stayed clear ahead and sealed behind. The fog wall followed at a distance, but no matter how fast or slow I went, it stayed the same space behind me. It didn't catch up. It didn't fall away. It just followed. I kept glancing at it in the mirror, checking to see if anything moved inside it. I thought I saw faint shifting once, like a darker patch drifting across the pale density. But every time I blinked, it disappeared. About 5 minutes later, the fog started thinning ahead again, this time gently. The road looked normal, trees on the left, cliffs on the right, nothing strange. Then the dashboard lights flickered, just a single pulse, dim, bright, dim. The engine didn't stutter, but the radio crackled, even though it had been off. My phone, plugged into the charger, vibrated once without receiving any notification. I didn't like the timing of any of that. When I looked back at the mirror again, the fog wall was gone. Completely gone. The air behind me was empty and clear, and I hadn't seen or heard it dissipate. I drove faster than I meant to for the next several miles, mostly out of instinct. Every few seconds, I checked the sky in case another shadow was hanging above the road. But the sky stayed normal. Too normal. I calmed down a little by the time I reached the turnout near Garrapatta, the one with the small wooden fence. I pulled over, mostly to breathe and tell myself I'd imagined the shape. Fog can do weird things, especially coastal fog. I'd seen it bend headlights before, distort silhouettes. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe it was one of those illusions where the fog density makes it look like something is floating. I got out and stood on the gravel. My breath blew sideways as a light breeze finally picked up. The ocean roared down below, steady and familiar. The night smelled like kelp and cold salt. Nothing strange. I turned off the truck and leaned against the hood, scanning the sky. Clear. Then I noticed something subtle. The fog line out to the south looked too straight. Instead of drifting like normal fog banks, the edge was perfectly even, like a sheet of fabric stretched across the coastline. A long, smooth boundary with no swirling, no soft edges, and it was moving. Slowly. Crawling north. Not rolling like fog does. Sliding. I froze and watched it approach. The line crept up the coastline, not rising or falling with the terrain, just gliding. Then it stopped. Perfectly. Maybe a quarter mile away, like it had reached some invisible boundary. My pulse hammered again. I got back in the truck, hands trembling a little as I turned the ignition. The dashboard lights dimmed again, not flickering this time, just dipping low and rising back to normal. As I pulled back onto the road, I kept an eye on the fog line. It stayed still, unmoving as I passed. But when I curved around the next bend, I saw a darker patch inside it, just for a second, like something large had shifted within the fog's thickness. I didn't slow down to check. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but the quiet felt heavy. I kept expecting the fog to reappear in my rearview mirror or a shadow to appear above the road again, but nothing happened. When I got home around 1:40 a.m., I sat in the driveway for a while with the engine running, headlights pointed at my garage. I watched the mirrors, making sure the fog hadn't followed me inland. The air in town was completely clear. Cold, still, ordinary. Inside, everything felt normal too. Heater humming, fridge cycling, the usual faint street noise. But when I lay down in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I kept replaying the moment the fog had cleared in an instant, right under that hovering shape. The sudden open air, the vanishing, the way the fog behind me had sealed like a door closing. And for a brief moment before I fell asleep, I thought I felt the same pressure in the air, the strange stillness I'd felt on the road. By morning, it was gone. But sometimes when I drive that same stretch of highway at night, I still check the fog for shapes hanging above it, just to make sure the road is empty. The motion lights started triggering in early March, right when the nights in Boise were still cold enough that you could see your breath even at dusk. I noticed it because my phone buzzed 3 times in one night, each alert coming from the camera I'd mounted above the back door. It wasn't unusual for it to catch a raccoon or the neighbor's cat, but when I checked the videos, each clip was the same. A 1-second flash of brightness, white and shapeless, like someone had pointed a flashlight into the lens from 2 feet away. No animals, no branches moving, no headlights from the alley, just the brightness. The timestamps bothered me more than the flashes. The alerts were at 1:42 a.m. exactly, 3 nights in a row. I tried brushing it off as a spider web catching the sensor or some electrical glitch. But when the 4th night arrived, I set an alarm for 1:40 and sat in the dark living room with the screen brightness turned all the way down. The curtains were open just enough that I could see the faint glow of the backyard motion light if it triggered. At 1:41, nothing happened. At 1:42, the motion light snapped on. The backyard lit up in a wide cone of yellowish light. I stood there holding my breath, waiting to hear something outside. A rustle, footsteps, anything. But there was no sound at all. The light stayed on for 15 seconds, then shut off. When I checked my phone, there was the alert, motion detected. Same flash in the footage. Same whiteness, so bright it washed out the frame. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I went out and wiped the camera lens, cleaned the sensor, checked all the wiring, and even moved the camera 10 degrees to the left in case it was catching some weird reflection. I also trimmed back the lilac bush that had overgrown the corner by the fence. I tried to eliminate every possible natural cause so I wouldn't feel stupid calling the power company or a security guy. But the alerts kept coming, always at 1:42 a.m. After a week of this, I stopped sleeping in my bedroom and started sleeping on the couch. The backyard window faces west, and even with the curtains closed, I could see the sudden bloom of light when it triggered. Every morning I'd check the footage. Every morning it was the same. Flash, white, gone. The worst part was that the brightness didn't behave like real light. When I paused the video frame by frame, the whole yard lit up, but nothing cast shadows. The fence didn't grow darker behind the garbage bins. The shed didn't get any highlights along the roof edge. The brightness looked flat, like it was coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. One night, maybe 10 days into this, I finally got desperate enough to stand outside and watch it happen in person. I bundled up in a sweater and sat on the cold step behind the kitchen door, holding my phone in my hand so I could check the time. 1:37. My backyard was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel natural. No wind, no traffic, no dogs barking. Even the air had that muted quality that reminded me of winter storms when everything gets hushed. 1:39. I started feeling stupid, like maybe nothing would happen because I was out there waiting for it. 41. I held my breath. 42. The light clicked on, but this time, the brightness didn't wash out the yard. The motion light shined normally, yellow, directional, faintly buzzing with that old bulb sound. Nothing unusual. I let out a shaky laugh, telling myself the camera glitch must only happen when I wasn't standing right under it. Maybe the warmth of a person screwed up the sensor differently. Then I noticed something behind the shed. A soft glow, pale and muted, like someone had taken the brightness from the videos and dimmed it to 10%, and dimmed it to 10%. It wasn't shining on anything, it was just there, hovering in a shape I couldn't define, not round, not angled, just a patch of air that looked lighter than it should have. I stood slowly, trying not to make a sound. The glow didn't move, it didn't flicker, it didn't pulse, it just existed in a way light shouldn't. I took one cautious step toward it. Instantly, the glow faded. Not like a dying bulb, more like someone sliding a dimmer until the glow blended perfectly into the darkness. The moment it vanished, the normal backyard sounds came rushing back. The distant hum of the freeway, a dog barking a few houses down, the rustle of dry leaves. The motion light shut off. I backed toward the house, slipped inside, and locked the door. I watched the footage the next morning. The flash was different this time. Instead of one white burst, it flickered twice. The timestamp still read 1:42. That day at work, I kept replaying the moment the glow faded. Not because it disappeared, but because the rest of the world came back at the exact same time. Like the glow had pushed everything else out while it existed. I started turning on every light in the house before bed. Not because I thought it would stop anything, but because the idea of sitting in darkness made my skin crawl. 2 nights later, something new happened. The motion alert triggered at 1:42 as always. I didn't get out of bed. I waited 5 minutes before checking the footage. This time, after the flash, the camera picked up something faint. Not an object, more like a distortion. A patch of the video where the pixels warped slightly, bending the fence line just a little, like heat rising off asphalt. It lasted less than a second, but when I replayed it, I could see it clearly. The distortion was exactly where I'd seen the glow 2 nights earlier. I saved the clip, though I didn't know why. The next day, I invited my neighbor Elise to look at the footage. She was practical, level-headed, and the kind of person who'd tell you were being ridiculous if she thought you were. She watched the videos twice, then frowned. "Is your camera glitching? Maybe the wiring's loose?" "Every night? Same time?" I said. She didn't have an answer. That night, I forced myself to sleep in my bedroom again. I tried to convince myself I couldn't spend the rest of my life sleeping on the couch. I shut the curtains tight and left the bedside lamp on. At 1:42 exactly, the backyard light triggered. Even through the curtains, I saw the faint bloom of brightness. I didn't get up. I didn't check the footage until morning. This time, there was no flash at all, just a faint, slow brightening over the course of half a second, like the sensor was seeing the shape without being overwhelmed by it. And the distortion, whatever it was, lasted longer. Maybe a full second. The air seemed to pinch inward around the glow, bending lines, pulling the image slightly toward a center point. Then it vanished. No flash, no movement, no explanation. I started thinking about unplugging the camera, but the idea of making the unknown invisible instead of recorded felt worse. So I left it up. Night after night, the alert kept coming. Sometimes I checked the footage right away. Sometimes I waited until morning. But the pattern stayed the same. Faint flashes, brief distortions, a presence that seemed to shift slightly each night. Occasionally the brightness appeared a few feet to the left or right of the frame, like whatever it was had moved. Once it appeared closer to the house, so close that the edge of the glow washed out part of the siding. But it always happened at 1:42. Never earlier, never later. I started waking up on my own at 1:40, even without an alarm. I'd lie there with my eyes open, waiting for the soft bloom of light through the curtains. Some nights I thought I heard something just before the motion triggered. A faint hum or a pressure shift in the air, like the house was holding its breath. But when the light clicked off, everything went back to normal. I still haven't figured out what the flashes mean, why the time never changes, why the glow moved closer that one night. All I know is that at 1:42 a.m., my motion light still turns on, and the camera still records something I can't explain. I was sitting by Lake Sundown the night it happened. The name makes it sound dramatic, but it's just a small lake outside Carlton, Minnesota. Quiet, surrounded by pines, the kind of place people fish at during the day and ignore at night. I'd driven out there after work because I'd had one of those long, restless evenings where you don't want to sit inside, and the idea of watching the water seemed better than staring at my ceiling. It was late September, cool but not freezing yet. A thin mist was drifting off the lake, not thick enough to hide anything, just enough to soften the air. I parked near the boat launch and walked to the little clearing where the grass flattened into a rough shoreline. The lake was perfectly still. Not a ripple, not a duck, nothing. The moon was only a sliver, barely reflecting. I sat down on a half-buried log with a thermos of coffee and tried to relax. It was quiet enough that I could hear insects in the grass behind me. Every now and then a car hissed down the distant highway. Otherwise, it felt like the whole lake was holding its breath. I don't know how long I sat there before I noticed the reflection. At first, I thought it was a fish rising, just a sudden bright glint under the surface. Lake sundown isn't deep, and sometimes the right angle of the moon can make things look brighter than they really are. But this glint didn't fade. It grew sharper, almost like a line of light, a streak of brightness beneath the water. I leaned forward, squinting. The water wasn't moving. There were no waves, nothing that would distort a reflection, but the reflection itself was moving. Slowly. It slid across the lake bed like someone was dragging a flashlight under the water. It wasn't bobbing or shifting with the surface. It moved in a dead straight path, smooth and steady, like it didn't care what the water above it was doing. "There's nothing out here," I muttered to myself, as if saying it would make the reflection behave normally. I looked up at the sky, thinking maybe a helicopter or a plane was passing overhead. Nothing, just a few stars, weak through the haze. No beams, no flashes, no movement. When I looked back down, the bright streak had drifted closer, maybe 20 yards from the shore now. I didn't hear anything, no engine, no splashing, but as the light moved, the tiniest rings appeared on the surface, like vibrations too gentle to be real. They didn't spread outward the way normal ripples do. They tightened inward, almost like the surface was being pulled. I stood up. The light responded. It froze, just stopped mid-drift. I held still, heart thumping. The air felt heavier suddenly, as if something large was pushing down on the atmosphere. Even the insects behind me went quiet. The entire shoreline turned silent in a way that didn't feel natural, like sound had been switched off. I took one cautious step back from the edge. The light flickered once, bright, then dim, before holding steady again. I didn't want to turn around. I don't know why. Something in the stillness made me feel like the lake itself was watching me, waiting. I kept my eyes on the glowing streak below the surface. After a few seconds, it began to move again, but not toward me this time, sideways, tracing a slow arc. The arc tightened gradually until the reflection formed a faint curve beneath the surface. Then the curve folded in on itself, shrinking but never losing brightness. The light didn't behave like it belonged to anything physical. It wasn't scattering or refracting. It was too clean, too controlled. I didn't realize I'd stepped closer again until the toes of my boots touched wet sand. The glow jerked sharply. Not toward me, away. It darted under the water in a straight line, faster than before, like it had been startled. The movement was so smooth that the surface didn't break until the light passed beneath a shallower stretch near the reeds. Then a faint wake appeared, just one line, before vanishing completely. I held my breath and scanned the shoreline, waiting for the light to reappear. It didn't. But the lake didn't return to normal either. The mist over the water thickened, pulling closer to the surface in slow drifts that didn't match the air movement. The quiet deepened even more. I could hear my own breathing, louder than the water itself. I checked my phone. 10:48 p.m. I could have sworn it had only been a few minutes since I sat down, but the thermos beside me was already cool to the touch. I took a few steps along the shore, scanning the water. My footsteps sounded too loud on the damp sand. The mist parted around me in slow curls. I kept expecting the light to appear again, maybe farther out or coming from a different direction. Nothing. Just the lake. Still. Dark. I turned back toward my car, telling myself I was overreacting, that it had been a reflection from something on the highway, or some weird underwater phenomenon. But halfway across the clearing, I felt a pressure shift in the air that made me stop mid-step. It was subtle, like the atmosphere had tightened around my ears. I looked back at the lake. The surface was glowing. Not brightly, just a faint wash of pale silver spreading across the top of the water, moving from the far end of the lake toward where I'd been standing. It wasn't moonlight. The moon was too thin, too far away, and it wasn't bright enough to cover the lake like that. The glow grew closer in slow waves, but the water didn't move with it. No ripples, no wind, just a sheet of dim light gliding across the surface like a reflection that had lost its source. I took another step backward, pulse hammering in my throat. The glow stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. A perfect, dead halt about 30 yards from the shore. I waited for something, anything, to break the silence. A frog. A bird. Even a gust of wind. But the world stayed locked in that freeze-framed stillness. Then, from directly beneath the glowing area, bubbles rose. Small ones at first, barely making a sound. Then larger ones, spaced evenly, too evenly. They rose in a vertical line as if marking a path upward. When they reached the surface, they didn't pop like normal bubbles. They slipped soundlessly into nothing. The glow dimmed, slowly, softening until the water turned dark again. The bubbles stopped, the mist settled, and the quiet eventually lifted, not all at once, but in layers. First, distant insects, then the subtle lap of water against the reeds. Finally, the faint hum of the highway. I didn't move until all of those sounds returned. When they did, I walked straight to my car, hands shaking, trying to act like everything was normal, even though my legs felt numb. I kept glancing back at the lake while I unlocked the door, half expecting the glow to return. It didn't. The drive home felt wrong, though. The darkness along the trees looked too heavy. Every reflective sign seemed brighter. My phone restarted itself once without me touching it. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a minute with the engine running, trying to slow my breathing. The world around me looked ordinary again, and that almost made it worse. Inside, I checked the time. 11:31 p.m. I'd only spent maybe an hour at the lake, but it felt like much longer. I still go back to Lake Sundown sometimes, during the day or early evening. I've never seen the glow again. I've never seen anything moving underwater that shouldn't be, but every time I stand by that shoreline, I get the same faint feeling in my chest, like something is waiting under the water, just beyond where the light can reach. And I never stay past dusk anymore. I was sitting at the stoplight on Prescott and Maple when the radio cut out. It was a normal Tuesday night in late October, cold enough that the inside of my windshield kept fogging at the corners, and the street was practically empty. I just finished a late shift at the grocery distribution center, the kind that leaves your brain drifting somewhere between awake and asleep. I wasn't thinking about anything except getting home, heating leftover pasta, and zoning out. The light turned red just as I rolled up. I coasted to a stop, my wipers squeaking across the glass. The radio was playing an old rock station, low-volume background noise. Then, without warning, the music shut off mid-guitar riff and switched to static. Not normal static. Not the crackling kind you get when you lose a signal. This was deeper, more even, like white noise pushed through a subwoofer. Before I could reach for the dial, a low tone layered itself under the static, a steady hum that dipped at the edges, like someone sliding a finger along the rim of a glass. It vibrated through the steering wheel, through my palms, through my jaw. The tone lasted maybe 4 seconds, maybe 5, then stopped abruptly. The static kept going another second before the radio cut off completely. Total silence in the car. I frowned, tapped the power button. Nothing. The display was frozen on the song info like the station was still playing, but no sound came out. I glanced at the intersection, half expecting the light to have cycled while I was distracted. Instead, the whole place seemed stalled. There was no cross traffic, no pedestrians, no wind. Just the suspended quiet you get in warehouses when the machinery shuts down. That was when I saw the light. At first, I thought it was a street lamp flickering, but street lamps don't hover below the wires, and this thing hung maybe 20 feet above the intersection, off-center, suspended like someone had pinned it to the air. It wasn't bright, just a dim white glow, not round or square, more like a narrow smear of light floating in place. Imagine someone highlighting the air with a glowing pen, but only a small stroke. It didn't move. It didn't pulse. It just hung there. I squinted through the windshield, thinking maybe I was seeing a reflection from inside the car. I shifted my head left and right. The light didn't move with me. I rolled down the window. Cold air rushed in, and for a second the fog on the glass cleared just enough for me to get a sharper view. The dim shape shimmered like it was behind heat ripples. It wasn't attached to anything. No wires, no pole, no drone silhouette. Just suspended. The light turned green, but I didn't move. The glow started drifting. Slowly. Sideways. Not like a balloon or a plane or anything influenced by wind. The motion was too controlled, too smooth. It glided across the intersection until it was right above the opposite crosswalk. Then it stopped again. The buzzing in my jaw came back. Not a sound this time, more like residual pressure. I rested my fingers on the center console to steady myself, but they felt numb. Everything in the car felt electrically charged, like the moment right before lightning hits nearby. The dim glow lowered slightly. Only a foot or two, but enough that I gasped. The movement was unnatural, like something testing range. I looked around to see if any other cars were coming. No one. Not a single headlight in any direction. I reached for my phone, thinking I should film it, but the screen wouldn't turn on. It was at 60% battery when I left work. Now it vibrated once in my hand, then went dead. The glow brightened faintly. Not enough to light the pavement, just enough that I could see the outline more clearly. It wasn't a shape exactly, no sharp edges, but the center was denser, almost like a solid object was wrapped in haze. The pressure in the car increased. Not painful, just heavy. I could hear it in the air vents, a faint throbbing that didn't match the engine. Then the tone came back. Not through the radio, not through anything I could pinpoint. Just a deep, resonant hum filling the cabin, vibrating through my bones. I pressed my palms to my ears out of instinct, but the sound didn't dampen. The light flickered, one quick dimming, like a blink, then slid upward, rising until it was level with the traffic signal. The hum stopped immediately. My ears rang. Then everything snapped back to normal. Wind blew through the intersection, scattering leaves. A truck turned onto Maple from somewhere behind me, engine rumbling. My phone buzzed back to life, the screen turning on with a delayed glow. The radio display refreshed, and the song resumed from the middle of a chorus. I jerked my head toward the intersection. The dim light was gone. The sky above was empty, just dark and starless. No aircraft, no trail, no glow behind clouds. The traffic signal blinked yellow for turning vehicles like nothing had happened. I sat frozen until the truck behind me honked. I jumped, hands scrambling back to the wheel. I drove through the intersection faster than I should have, glancing up every second at the spot where the glow had hung. Nothing. My neighborhood was only 5 minutes away, but those 5 minutes felt stretched and wrong. Every street lamp buzzed faintly. The radio cut out once more for half a second. Not to static this time, just silence, and then came back like nothing had happened. When I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed again. A missed call from unknown, timestamped 1:33 a.m. The call came in right when the tone had stopped. I didn't answer it, obviously, but I stared at the timestamp for a long time. I checked the voicemail box, even though I never get unknown voicemails. There was one message, 6 seconds long. I played it. Silence. Not muffled conversation, not breathing. Just silence. Too clean and too absolute to be the result of a bad connection. I sat on the edge of my bed after going inside, listening to my own house settle, heater kicking, fridge humming, the normal stuff. Everything seemed fine. But the moment I closed my eyes, I felt that same faint vibration in my jaw. A ghost of the tone, like the memory of a hum that had been too deep for actual sound. And from that night on, whenever I'm at a stoplight late, especially on roads without much traffic, I catch myself checking the air above the intersection before the light changes, just in case something is hovering there again, watching before it moves. I woke up with the certainty that someone had been standing next to my bed. Not a dream, not sleep paralysis. I was fully awake when the feeling hit me. 1 second I was asleep, and the next I was sitting upright, heart pounding, staring into the dark corner of my room like I just missed someone stepping out of reach. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge downstairs. It wasn't fear of an intruder. It was the sense of presence, that unexplainable heaviness in the air you feel when someone is standing too close. Except the moment I woke, that weight vanished, like I'd startled it off. I ran my hand over my face, trying to shake off the leftover adrenaline. Um, my phone said 3:28 a.m. I usually slept through the night without issues, and I couldn't remember the last time I woke up this suddenly. I swung my legs off the bed and took a breath. That's when I felt it. Warm air. It came from the window by the foot of my bed, a soft, steady warmth that had no business being there at that hour. Outside, it was mid-December in northern Idaho. The nights were below freezing. The windows were old and drafty, and usually the cold seeped through them like they weren't even closed. But the air around the window felt warm, gently warm, like a heater vent was blowing from outside. I stood and walked toward it slowly, half expecting to find the window cracked open. But the latch was locked. The glass was cold to the touch. The frame, though, just an inch or two above it, felt warmer, as if something had been pressed there seconds earlier. I slid the curtain aside just a bit. The backyard was dark. No lights, no movement. Frost covered the grass in a soft layer that glowed slightly in the moonlight. My breath fogged the glass. I waited, watching for anything. Nothing happened. After a minute, I let the curtain fall back into place, but I stayed there, standing a foot from the window, feeling that residual heat on my skin. It reminded me of the warmth left over when someone steps away from a lamp or a fire, fading but still noticeable. I backed away and flicked on the bedside lamp. The room didn't look any different. My shoes were where I'd left them, my jacket on the chair, the door closed, nothing out of place. Still, something felt wrong. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to think rationally. Maybe the heater vent downstairs had kicked on and somehow pushed warm air up through the walls. Maybe I'd left the window open earlier without remembering, but there was no warm draft anywhere else in the room, only near that one spot. I walked downstairs to check the thermostat. It read 64 degrees, lower than I usually kept it, but I'd set it that way before going to bed. The heater wasn't running. I checked the front and back doors. Both locked, no windows cracked. I stood in the kitchen for a minute, listening. My house was built in the 70s and normally complained with every temperature shift, creaks, pops, the works. That night it was unnervingly still. I went back upstairs. The moment I stepped into my bedroom, I knew the warmth had faded. The air was cold again, the normal winter chill that seeped in overnight. Whatever warmth I'd felt earlier had completely dissipated. The certainty that someone had been there came flooding back, just as strong. I didn't want to sleep, but exhaustion eventually won. I lay down with the lamp still on and pulled the covers up. It took a long time to drift off. Later, maybe an hour, maybe more, I woke again, but this time to a sound. A soft tapping. Not on the window, on the wall beside it. 3 taps spaced out. Slow, measured. I held my breath, staring at the wall. The tapping didn't repeat. The silence settled again. I forced myself to sit up and listen. The house stayed silent. No pipes, no settling, nothing. I got out of bed, heart pounding again, and moved toward the window. I didn't touch it this time. I just stood near it and listened. The air was cold now, but there was something else. A faint crackling sound, like static, drifting from behind the curtain. Not loud enough to be electrical noise. Not natural enough to be anything I could explain. I braced myself and pulled the curtain aside. The backyard was still empty, but the frost near the window looked disturbed. A small patch of it, maybe a foot long, had melted into bare soil as if a warm shape had hovered close to the glass from the outside. I leaned closer, pressing my forehead lightly to the cold pane. That's when I noticed the reflection. Not behind me, above me. A faint glow, not bright, more like the suggestion of light, hung near the ceiling, just a soft patch of brightness that didn't come from any lamp or moonbeam. It hovered in the reflection for maybe a half second before fading. I spun around. Nothing was there. The air behind me was empty. I stared at the ceiling, then back at the window. The reflection didn't return, but the warm spot on the wall, just to the right of the window frame, was back. Faint, barely noticeable, like a handprint pressed into the drywall that held warmth longer than it should. I reached out and placed my fingers on it. It felt warm. Not hot, not heating vent warm, more like body heat. But deeper in the material, not on the surface. My throat tightened. I backed away again, grabbed my jacket from the chair, and left the room. I didn't want to stay in there waiting for it to happen again. The rest of the night I spent downstairs on the couch, every light on, staring at the ceiling anytime the house creaked. I didn't fall asleep until dawn started tinting the windows. When I went back upstairs in daylight, the wall by the window was cold. The frost outside had returned. Everything looked normal. But the memory of that warmth, its perfect placement, its timing, and the brief glow in the window reflection stayed with me all day, like a breadcrumb trail leading nowhere. That night, I slept with the door open and the hallway light on. I told myself the feeling wouldn't return, but at 3:28 a.m. the next night, I woke again. Certain, undeniably certain, someone had been standing next to my bed, and the air near the window was warm. I was about 4 miles into the Ridgewater Loop when the forest went silent. Not quiet, silent. It happened so suddenly that I stopped mid-step, one boot hovering over the trail, thinking maybe I'd gone temporarily deaf. A second earlier, the woods south of Kalispell had been full of normal noise. Wind in the branches, a distant woodpecker, the trickle of a creek somewhere off to my right. Then everything cut off at the exact same instant, like someone pressed mute on the entire valley. I set my foot down slowly and turned in a circle. The trees looked the same, tall pines, scattered birch, late-season sunlight patching the ground in broken shapes, but the silence made them feel hollow, like a photograph instead of a real place. I said hello out loud just to break the stillness. The sound of my voice hit the trees strangely, sharp and too close, like the forest had shrunken around me. No echo, no carry, just a flat, clipped noise that dropped off faster than it should have. I tried listening harder, expecting some noise to rise back in, but nothing came. Even the air felt heavy and motionless. My breathing sounded loud enough that I became self-conscious of it. I was alone on the trail. It was a weekday morning in late October, and I hadn't seen another person since the trailhead. I told myself it was just a big predator nearby, a mountain lion maybe, or a bear, and everything else had gone quiet. But I'd lived in Montana long enough to know what that kind of silence felt like, and this wasn't it. This wasn't tension or alertness. This was absence, as if the entire forest was holding its breath for something that hadn't arrived yet. Then I noticed the shimmer. It hung between two narrow pines, maybe 30 feet off the trail. At first, I thought sunlight was reflecting off a spider web or a patch of moisture, but the air around it wasn't moving, and the shimmer wasn't on any surface. It hovered. Suspended in midair, a faint wavering of light, no bigger than a backpack, like heat rising off asphalt but colder, sharper. I squinted at it. The shimmer pulsed, not brighter, just steadier. For a brief moment, it held a distinct shape, almost oval, before losing definition again. It wasn't glowing, but it was unmistakably there, warping the view of the tree trunks behind it like a lens shifting focus. The silence pressed harder around me. My heartbeat thumped in my ears, and for a second I thought I might faint from how wrong everything felt. I took one step toward it. Instantly, the shimmer contracted, pulling tight into a smaller shape, like it sensed the movement. Not disappearing, just compressing, almost bracing. I froze again. My throat tightened. I couldn't think of anything to say or do that didn't feel stupid. I kept staring at the distortion, waiting for it to dissolve or drift away or prove itself to be something normal, but it just hovered. The air felt thick around it, heavy, charged in a way I couldn't explain. I had the urge to back up, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like my body didn't trust me to make the right choice. Then, from somewhere behind me, a single branch snapped. In any other situation, that would have been comforting. Natural. But the sound was wrong. It didn't echo. It didn't blend back into the forest. It cut sharply through the silence like it was being played in a separate room. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing stood on the trail. No animals. No movement. The branch lay broken across the path, but even that looked strange, like it was sharper in color than the things around it. When I turned back to the shimmer, it had stretched vertically, as if rising. The distortion elongated between the trunks, pulling upward like a strip of warped glass being lifted. It didn't brighten or darken, just shifted shape unnaturally, bending the trees behind it until they looked bowed. A soft vibration started in my jaw. At first, I thought it was a muscle twitch from adrenaline, but the vibration grew steadier, humming through my teeth and into my ears. Not a sound exactly, more like pressure. The same kind you get before a storm hits, except focused in a single spot. The shimmer pulsed again. and just as I took a breath, the forest noise came back all at once, not gradually, like a switch flipping. Birds chattered overhead, winds stirred the needles. Somewhere far off, the creek resumed its trickling. Every sound snapped into place instantly, too loud after the silence. The shimmer dissolved. It didn't fade or drift. It collapsed inward in a split second, like a bubble popping, but without any movement of air. The trees behind it returned to normal clarity. The air loosened. The vibration in my jaw stopped. I staggered back, suddenly aware that I'd been leaning forward without meaning to. For a moment, I couldn't decide whether to run or pretend nothing had happened. My body chose for me. I started walking quickly down the trail, almost tripping over my own boots. The normal sounds of the forest followed me, but they felt foreign, like they were trying too hard to act natural. About 10 minutes later, I stopped to catch my breath and realized something else was wrong. I couldn't remember the last minute of walking. Not in a lost time way, more like my brain had skipped recording it. One moment I was leaving the area where the shimmer had been, and the next I was farther down the trail with no memory of what happened in between. My heart rate was still elevated, so I knew I'd been moving quickly, but everything between those points felt blank. I checked my phone, 10:14 a.m. I hadn't looked at it since I'd left the trailhead 3 hours earlier. Everything seemed normal, battery percentage, time, notifications, but when I tried to pull up a map just to orient myself, the screen refused to load anything. GPS was blank. The compass spun slowly without stabilizing. I turned the phone off and back on. Same thing. I shoved it in my pocket and kept walking. When I finally reached the trailhead, a pair of hikers were getting ready to start their loop. They nodded at me casually, and I managed to nod back, but I could barely look them in the eye. I didn't want to say anything because I had no idea what there was to say. I got into my car and sat for a long time before turning the engine over. My hands were still shaking. The entire drive home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the air behind the car shimmering. Nothing followed me. Nothing hovered above the road. Nothing appeared in my peripheral vision. But that night, when I closed my eyes, I saw the moment the forest fell silent. I heard the absence more clearly than the sounds that came back afterward. And I felt the vibration in my jaw, a deep, steady pressure that seemed to come from inside the woods themselves. The next morning, out of curiosity, I checked my phone again. The GPS worked, the compass worked, everything was normal. Except for one detail. The last recorded location on my hiking app, a breadcrumb from the auto-tracking feature I didn't even realize was on, showed a single point off the trail, about 30 feet from where I had been standing, right where the shimmer had been hanging between the trees. I saw the object while I was sitting outside the small rental cabin I'd booked near Cedar Ridge, Colorado. It was early June, the kind of warm, quiet evening where the air cools fast after sunset and the sky turns that deep blue that almost looks fake. I'd spent the day hiking and came back to the cabin exhausted, too tired to even make dinner. I just sat on the porch steps with a bottle of water, staring up at the sky through the gaps in the pines. I hadn't been out there long when I noticed a bright object moving across the sky. At first I assumed it was a plane, but it was too steady. No blinking lights, no contrail, no change in brightness. It moved like it was sliding along a rail, perfectly smooth, not drifting or wavering the way aircraft usually do at that distance. I kept watching it because the steadiness was strange, not dramatic, just off enough that I couldn't look away. The object glided west to east, crossing overhead in a straight, deliberate line. It was brighter than Venus ever gets, but not blinding, just a solid white point with sharper edges than any star. I sat forward on the step and followed it with my eyes until something even stranger happened. It paused. Not slowed. Paused. Stopped dead in the sky like someone had hit a freeze frame button. The trees around me stayed still. The night kept doing its normal night things, but the object hung motionless, as if the sky had temporarily become a solid surface. I waited for it to move again. For a few seconds, nothing happened. I started wondering if I'd misjudged things. Maybe it was turning, losing brightness, aligning in a way that made it look stationary. Then it dropped straight down, not at an angle, not on any curve. A perfect vertical descent, fast enough to be unnatural, but not so fast that it vanished instantly. more like it sank. The way a coin falls through water, not whipping downward, just sliding out of view with too much control. It disappeared behind the tree line without any flash or impact glow, just gone. I stayed frozen on the step, staring at the place where it had vanished. The sky looked totally normal again. I told myself it had to be a drone. People around Cedar Ridge flew them sometimes, though rarely at night, and none I'd ever seen moved that smoothly or covered that kind of distance. Still, thinking it was a drone made me feel better, even though deep down I knew it didn't match anything I'd seen before. I stood up, listening to the woods. Everything sounded normal. Crickets, wind brushing the branches, a distant stream. I walked to the edge of the clearing just to see if anything looked unusual. It didn't. The pines were tall and dark and identical to each other, blocking any view of where the object might have gone. As I turned back toward the cabin, my phone in my pocket buzzed. I pulled it out and saw a notification. Missed call, unknown number, time-stamped 1 minute earlier. The signal at the cabin was spotty, so I didn't think much of it until I saw the battery percentage. It had been at 62% when I'd walked outside. Now it was at 27%. I hadn't used it. I frowned, turned on the flashlight app to check if maybe the drop was a glitch, but the light didn't turn on. The phone froze for a second, then the screen went dark entirely. I went back inside for a portable charger. When I plugged the phone in, it vibrated weakly and turned back on, but half the apps wouldn't load. The flashlight still refused to work. Even the clock froze for a moment before updating. I set it down on the small kitchen table and returned to the porch, feeling uneasy without knowing exactly why. A few minutes passed. The sky stayed empty. I started to relax slightly, enough to lean back against one of the support posts and take a deep breath, until I noticed something above the ridge. Not a light this time, a faint distortion. It looked like a patch of air was warping, like heat shimmer rising off asphalt, except it was nighttime and the temperature had dropped below 50. The distortion moved horizontally above the tree line, not glowing but subtly bending the stars behind it. The shape reminded me of someone dragging a barely visible fingertip across glass. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then it smoothed out and the stars realigned. I felt a pressure in my chest then, not panic, just a deep instinct telling me to go inside. I backed toward the door slowly, trying not to make sudden movements, even though I knew that was irrational. Inside the cabin, I locked the door, though I doubted it would matter if I was dealing with something lights and distortions. I turned on every lamp in the little space. The place only had one room besides the bathroom, and the shadows from the pine logs felt darker than they had earlier. My phone, still on the table, vibrated again. One new voicemail, same unknown number. I didn't want to listen, but I couldn't stop myself. I pressed play. Static. Not the kind from radio or cell signal issues. This was soft, even, almost rhythmic. A steady hiss that rose and fell like breathing, not human breathing, more like something shifting air without lungs. The recording lasted 8 seconds, then cut off. I replayed it. Same thing. I deleted it immediately. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the object dropping straight down, disappearing into the forest like it was slipping beneath a surface I couldn't see. I kept thinking of the shimmer afterward, bending the stars like whatever had dropped was still moving around, unseen. Around 4 a.m., just when exhaustion finally pulled me under, a single vibration from my phone woke me again. No call this time. Just a notification I didn't recognize, an error message I'd never seen before. It said, "Signal lost," with a timestamp of 11:16 p.m. That was the exact minute the object had paused. I stayed awake until sunrise. As soon as the sky lightened, I walked out to the porch and looked toward the ridge. Birds were calling. Squirrels darted across the clearing. Everything looked completely normal. I packed up that morning and left the cabin a day early. I didn't tell the rental owners why. I didn't know how to explain something like that in a way that sounded sane. On the drive back toward town, I kept scanning the sky. Every bright star, every airplane, every glint of light. Nothing moved the way that object had. Nothing paused. Nothing dropped away. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that if I drove back to that clearing at the same hour on another quiet June night, I'd see that bright point glide across the sky again, smooth, perfect, steady, and then watch it fall straight down into the trees, disappearing into a place I wasn't meant to follow. The power went out around 9:20 p.m. I remember the exact time because I had been microwaving leftover stew in my place outside Wadsworth, Nevada, and the microwave stopped mid-rotation with a hard click. The whole house went dark at once. No flicker, no ramping down, just immediate black. I figured a transformer blew somewhere. It wasn't unusual out there. My house sat on a dirt road with maybe 6 others scattered across a stretch of scrubland, the kind of place where outages were just part of life. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight, saw the battery was only at 18%, and set it down so I wouldn't drain it. My first instinct was to check outside, see if the neighbors' houses were dark too. The night was quiet when I stepped onto the porch. No wind, no insects, no distant highway hum. Even the usual barking from the McLean's dog 2 lots over wasn't happening. Just stillness. Then the sky changed. It didn't brighten or flash, it shifted. In less than a second, the entire sky turned a flat, dull gray. Not storm gray, not clouds. It looked metallic somehow, like brushed steel stretched across the whole horizon. No shine, no texture, just a uniform muted gray shape covering everything. I stared up, confused. The weather had been perfectly clear earlier. I'd watched a bright, normal sunset maybe an hour before. There hadn't been a single cloud. Now the sky looked like it had been painted over, and it wasn't just overhead, it was everywhere. Horizon to horizon, as if the real sky had been swapped out. The silence made it worse. There was no thunder, no wind rushing in with a sudden front, no crackling power lines, just that metallic sky sitting there, too smooth, too even. After maybe 3 seconds, it's hard to judge, the gray deepened slightly. Not darker exactly, but richer, like a second layer had been added. I felt a pressure shift then, a faint pop in my left ear, the kind you get when altitude changes. I whispered, "What the hell?" The sound of my voice felt swallowed, as though it couldn't travel far. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the metallic sky faded. The gray thinned like diluted paint until it dissolved completely, revealing clear, star-filled darkness. No clouds, no sign anything had happened. The silence remained. I stood there for a minute, waiting for something. Wind, insects, a plane overhead, anything. But the world stayed unnaturally still. My phone buzzed unexpectedly behind me, vibrating on the counter through the open door. I went inside. The screen was lit, but instead of a notification, it showed the time as 2:11 a.m. I blinked at it. That wasn't possible. I checked the wall clock out of instinct. It was dead, of course, with the power still out. I looked at my phone again. 2:11 a.m. Battery at 17%. The house looked exactly as it had minutes before. Microwave door still open, everything frozen in the same positions. Yet 4 hours had supposedly passed. I stepped back onto the porch. The stars were still bright. The silence finally broke. A single gust of wind pushing across the yard, stirring the sagebrush. I listened hard. Crickets started up a few beats later. A dog barked somewhere far off. The world was rebooting. I walked a few paces into the yard and looked up again, half expecting the sky to shift back to that metallic blanket. It didn't, but something felt off in the air. The cold had a strange sharpness, like it hadn't settled naturally. I noticed something else too. The fence post near the west side of my yard was warm. Not hot, warm like someone had cupped their hand around it moments earlier. The wood around it was cold with the night air, except for a single patch the size of a dinner plate. I held my palm over it. The warmth radiated faintly, still dissipating. I checked the other posts. All cold. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I just stood there, arms crossed against the chill, staring at the stars and trying to shake off the disorientation. My phone still insisted it was after 2 a.m. Maybe the outage messed with it, I told myself. Maybe the internal clock jumped. Back inside, I lit a candle and sat on the couch. The house felt wrong, like I'd come back to it after being gone longer than I remembered. The air was thick and slightly humid, though Nevada nights were bone dry. Even the quiet tick of the cooling microwave sounded delayed. Around 2:30, the power surged back. Lights blinked on. The fridge kicked in. The microwave restarted its cycle for half a second before beeping angrily. I stood up too fast. Something about the lights returning made my stomach twist. I checked the thermostat. It had reset to factory settings. The oven clock blinked 12. The TV was on the wrong input. Things that usually held memory through an outage had all reset. I picked up my phone, expecting the power returning to sync the clock. It didn't. Still 2:14 a.m. I sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on my knees, trying to retrace everything. The stew, the microwave stopping, walking outside, the metallic sky, the silence, the return to normal. There was no gap where 4 hours could fit. My beard stubble wasn't longer. The candle I'd lit wasn't melted down. Even my water bottle was still cold. Just the time. And the warm patch on the fence. I finally forced myself to go to bed around 3, though I left the hallway light on. I expected to dream about the sky. Instead, I didn't dream at all. When I woke, sunlight filled the room and everything looked painfully normal. For a second, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I stepped outside. The fence post was still there, but the wood in that warm patch looked slightly different. Darker, smoother, almost polished. Like the surface had been pressed or heated enough to change its texture. I ran my fingers over it. The shape was subtle but definitely there, slightly oval. I walked the entire yard after that, checking for footprints, scorch marks, anything. Nothing else stood out. The power company left a voicemail later saying the outage affected only a very small area, just 2 streets. A failed line sensor, they said, though they didn't usually fail in completely clear weather. That night, around the same time, I stepped outside again. No outage, no metallic sky, just stars and cold wind. But something in the air still felt watchful. Not threatening, just aware. 4 days later, my phone randomly displayed the time as 9:20 p.m. Again, for a split second, even though it was mid-afternoon. It corrected itself immediately. No other glitches. I still live in the same house. I still use the same microwave. But whenever the power flickers, even for a fraction of a second, I find myself glancing at the sky, terrified of seeing it flatten into that dull metallic sheet again, silent and unnatural, covering everything without a single reason why. And sometimes late at night, the air near that same fence post feels warm again. I was walking home from my friend Jonah's place when it happened. It was close to midnight, a cold early spring night in Missoula, where the air smelled like thawing earth and leftover snowmelt. I'd stayed later than I meant to, talking about nothing important, and decided to walk instead of calling a rideshare since I only lived about 15 minutes away. The streets were quiet, mostly residential, a few porch lights on, windows dark. I cut through Alder Park like I always did. It wasn't really a park, more of an elongated green strip that followed a bike path between 2 neighborhoods. At night, it felt isolated because the lamps along the path flickered a lot and barely covered the length of the walkway. I'd walked it 100 times without thinking about it. I was passing the little cluster of pine trees near the middle of the path when I noticed my shadow stretching strangely ahead of me. At first I thought I'd imagined it. Shadows warp all the time under dim streetlights. But when I stepped forward again, the shadow shot out far longer than it should have, maybe 20 or 30 feet, stretching way past the reach of the nearest lamp. I stopped. The shadow froze with me, but it didn't look right. The edges were too sharp, and instead of blending into the path, it looked like it extended over flat ground that wasn't there. Almost like the path had become a screen and someone was projecting my outline onto it. I turned around to see if maybe a car had pulled onto the adjacent road or if a porch light had come on. Nothing. Every house was dark. The street was empty. The usual hum of distant traffic felt softened, like someone had turned down the volume of the whole city. I faced forward again. My shadow twitched. Not much, just a quick snap shorter by a few inches, like whatever was casting it had shifted. I instinctively stepped back, and the shadow elongated even farther, stretching into a weird, distorted line that made the proportions wrong. My arms looked too long in the silhouette. My head looked too narrow. It didn't look like a real shadow anymore. I whispered, "No, no, no," under my breath and stepped sideways off the path. The shadow didn't follow me. Instead, it stayed fixed to one spot on the pavement, even though I had clearly moved out of alignment with any imaginable light source. It stretched straight toward a point in the sky above the trees, too high for a lamp, too low for a plane. That's when I felt the pressure change. The air around me thickened, not colder or warmer, just heavier. My ears popped softly, and the distant noises of the neighborhood thinned out until all I could hear was my own breathing. The street lamps flickered, but not in the usual random way. They flickered in sequence, one, then another, then the next. A faint glow appeared above the pines. Not bright, not like a spotlight. More like a patch of the sky had become less dark, a hazy disk of pale light that didn't have a source or edges. It hovered there, too still to be part of the natural night sky. As the glow held steady, my shadow snapped back, instantly, shrinking to the shape a normal shadow should have been under a nearby lamp. The sudden shift startled me so badly I stumbled backward into the grass. The glow overhead flickered once, then began to fade, slowly dimming until nothing remained but the ordinary dark sky. The moment it disappeared, all the ambient noise returned. The distant traffic, a dog barking, wind brushing the branches. The sequence of flickering lamps stopped. My ears unpopped. Everything fell back into place like a reset. I stayed crouched there in the grass, gripping the damp earth, breathing hard. I scanned the sky for anything, movement, a shape, another glow, but it was empty, completely ordinary. The pines shifted gently with the breeze. After maybe a minute, I forced myself to stand. My legs felt rubbery. I walked in a wide arc around the place where my shadow had stretched unnaturally, avoiding that spot on the path like it was a live wire. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I jumped, nearly dropping it. When I pulled it out, the lock screen was bright and normal, but the time made me stop. 12:03 a.m., 20 minutes later than I expected. The walk from Jonah's place to that part of the park shouldn't have taken more than 10 minutes, and I knew I hadn't been standing still for that long. The battery percentage had also dropped significantly, from 61% when I'd left his place to 34% now. I tried not to think about it. I put my phone away and kept walking, but every time I passed under a street lamp, I checked my shadow. It stayed normal the rest of the way home, though my heartbeat didn't settle until I was inside my apartment with the deadbolt locked. I sat at the kitchen table for a while, replaying everything. The shadow, the pressure, the glow, the silence. But what bothered me most was the timing. The reset of sound the moment the glow vanished, like its presence had pushed everything else out of alignment. Around 1 a.m., once I'd calmed down enough to think clearly, I went to the window facing the park. I expected darkness, but the lamps along the path were brighter than usual, steady, no flickering. I almost turned away when I noticed something near the base of the lamp closest to the pines. A long, narrow mark, almost a scorch but not quite, ran across the pavement in the same direction my shadow had stretched earlier. It wasn't pitch black, more like a faint discoloration, as if the ground had been warmed or compressed for a moment. I stared at it until fatigue finally overpowered me. I slept badly. When I left for work the next morning, the mark was still there, faint but unmistakable. By the time I returned that evening, it had faded almost completely. The path looked normal again. But even now, weeks later, when I walk home late, I avoid Alder Park. I stick to the longer, well-lit streets, and anytime a light behind me casts a shadow, I watch it carefully, waiting to see if it stretches farther than it should. So far it hasn't, but sometimes when the night is very still, I feel that same pressure in the air for a split second, and I find myself checking the sky for a fading glow I hope I never see again. I noticed the fitness tracker thing first. It was a Wednesday morning, early January, and I was still half asleep when I rolled over and checked my wrist. I usually did it without thinking, just part of the routine. But this time the screen showed something that jarred me awake. Movement detected, 3:12 a.m., 3:18 a.m., 6 minutes. I never get up in the middle of the night. I'm a ridiculously heavy sleeper. And even if I had, I would have remembered something that long. I sat up, confused, trying to convince myself it was a glitch. My apartment in Sandpoint isn't big, just a one-bedroom above an auto shop, so if I had walked around, I would have heard the creaky floorboards or knocked something over. Everything looked normal. But when I opened my bedroom curtains, the sky looked wrong. It was 6:47 a.m., still too early in January for any real sunrise, but the entire sky had this faint, washed-out brightness to it, like someone had turned on a backlight behind the clouds. No color, no sunlight, just a pale glow that didn't belong at that hour. I checked the weather app. Cloudy, snow expected later, nothing unusual. But the sky didn't look like storm light. It looked like when you shine a flashlight through your hand and the light spreads in all directions. I kept staring at it, feeling a slow uneasiness creep up my back. I told myself to stop overthinking it. I went to make coffee, scrolling through my notifications, pretending the tracker thing didn't bother me. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. 6 minutes is a long time, too long for sleepwalking, and I'd never done that before in my life. I checked the tracker's details again. Steps recorded 74. Heart rate elevated around 110 BPM. Location, that last part didn't make sense. My tracker used my phone's GPS, barely accurate indoors, and it said I hadn't left the room. How could I get 74 steps without going anywhere? I rubbed my face, trying to shake the creeping dread. Maybe I'd tossed and turned. Maybe it misread something. I tried to believe that. Then I looked at the carpet. Right beside the bed, the fibers were flattened in a long, curved pattern I didn't recognize, almost like someone had shuffled their feet there repeatedly. I stepped on it, testing the shape with my own movements, but it didn't match anything I'd done recently. The indentation stretched from the foot of the bed toward the window. My stomach tightened. I walked over and pulled the curtains aside again. The sky was still that strange, bright gray color. No sun, no visible clouds, just an even wash of light like the world had been dimly backlit. Something about it felt watched. I got dressed quickly, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside onto the metal stairway that led down from my unit. The air was sharp with cold, and the brightness above made everything on the ground look slightly desaturated. It wasn't snow glow either. The shop lights were off, the street was empty, and none of the neighbors had porch lights on. But the sky, it felt too close, like it was pressing down. As I reached the bottom of the steps, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting an email or calendar reminder. Instead, the fitness app flashed a notification I'd never seen before. Movement data incomplete. Sync error at 3:16 a.m. I stared at the screen, trying to figure out what that meant. The tracker had obviously logged something, so why was the app saying it lost data halfway through? I walked around the side of the building, looking up. The brightness didn't come from anywhere specific. No beams, no reflections. It just existed, like the atmosphere itself was glowing faintly. And then I heard it, a low hum. Not loud, deep, like something vibrating through the air rather than a sound traveling across it. It felt more physical than audible, almost like the hum you feel standing next to a big transformer, except there were no transformers nearby. The nearest one was 3 blocks away. The hum lasted maybe 2 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Right when it stopped, the sky dimmed slightly, like someone easing their hand off a dimmer switch. Not enough to look normal, but less bright than before. I turned slowly, scanning the rooftops, the empty street, the lot behind the shop. No movement, no cars, no one out walking their dog, just quiet stillness and that strange fading light. I went back up to my apartment because suddenly the outside felt too exposed. I locked the door behind me, which felt ridiculous. I wasn't scared of a person, but I locked it anyway. I sat on the edge of my bed, looking at the flattened carpet again. I tried recreating the pattern with my feet, standing in place, pivoting, shuffling, but the indentation was smoother, more uniform, like weight had been applied evenly, not concentrated on heels or toes. And the curve of it, it was too rounded, almost like someone had paced in a semicircle rather than walked straight. My heart started pounding. I checked my tracker one more time, hoping the data would look normal after a resync. But instead of correcting itself, it showed something new. 3:12 a.m. detected heart rate spike before movement. 3:13 a.m. detected standing position. 3:14 a.m. motion recorded. 3:15 a.m. motion continues. 3:16 a.m. sync error. 3:17 a.m. sync error. 3:18 a.m. motion stops. 3:18 a.m. heart rate drops suddenly. The tracker only logs heart rate drops like that when I'm sitting or lying perfectly still after being active. It didn't match anything someone would do sleepwalking. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to slow my breathing. That was when I noticed something else. Something I should have noticed earlier. The window was unlocked. Not fully open, just shifted enough that the latch wasn't fully in its catch. I always locked it. Not because I was paranoid, but because the drafts in winter were awful otherwise. I got up and touched the frame. It was cold. Normal cold. But the latch felt slightly warm, like someone had pressed a thumb against it. I locked it again with a shaky hand. Around 7:20, the sky finally started to brighten normally. The strange backlight faded into actual daylight, and by the time cars began moving on the street below, everything looked ordinary again. But when I checked my fitness tracker at work during lunch, a new notification was waiting. Unverified movement pattern detected. Review? I tapped it. The app displayed a simple graphic, just a line. A curved line, looping tight and shallow, repeating the same arc over and over. It looked almost identical to the flattened pattern in the carpet. Location, bedroom, duration, 6 minutes. Height variation, none. I turned off the screen and set the watch face down on my desk. I didn't review anything else. The sky has looked normal every night since then, but sometimes, especially early in the morning, I wake up with the uneasy feeling that the room isn't empty. And every time, before I move or turn or breathe too deeply, I check the carpet, just to make sure the pattern isn't back. I was driving back from Thompson Falls late on a Sunday night, taking the long stretch of Highway 200 that follows the river. It was cold enough for frost to form on the edges of the windshield, but not quite snowing. One of those dry Montana nights where everything feels sharper and quieter than usual. I'd stayed too long at a friend's place, lost track of time, and now I had an hour's drive home in near total darkness. The only other car I'd seen in 20 minutes was a logging truck heading the opposite direction. After that, it was just me, the hum of my old Subaru, and the pale yellow beam of the headlights cutting through the dark. I remember adjusting the heater and glancing down for just a second. When I looked back up, the headlights reflected off something in midair. A sharp flash, clean, metallic, unmistakably reflective, right above the road and maybe 30 feet ahead. High enough that it wasn't on the ground, but low enough that if it had been a sign, I would have known the stretch. I slowed down immediately, leaning forward over the wheel. My first thought was that maybe it was a piece of equipment hanging from a power line. But the power lines along that road run farther inland, not directly overhead. I rolled down the window a few inches, listening. Nothing. No engine noise except mine. No wind. The river on my right sounded quieter than usual, almost muted. Even the tires on the asphalt seemed too soft, like the road was absorbing the sound. I eased the car to the shoulder and stopped completely. My hands were tight on the wheel without me realizing it. I looked up toward the spot where the reflection had come from. Nothing there. Just empty air and a perfectly normal dark sky. No sign, no wire, no bird. Nothing that could have thrown back such a bright, clean flash. I turned off the headlights to see better. That was a mistake. The darkness closed in so fast it felt physical. A heavy, absolute black that swallowed the road and the trees. I switched them back on immediately, heart skipping. As the light flooded the road again, I saw something drift across the beam. Not an object, more like a distortion. The kind of shimmer you see above asphalt on a hot day. But this was winter, late at night, and it passed horizontally across the beam like a soft ripple in the air. I held my breath. The shimmer slowed, then stopped directly in front of the car. For a moment, the headlights looked slightly dimmer, like they were being absorbed by whatever I was looking at. Then the distortion collapsed inward, almost like it folded into itself. The headlights brightened again, and everything looked normal. I stayed parked for a long moment, trying to steady my breathing. The cold coming through the cracked window felt oddly warm in the chest, like my own body couldn't figure out how to regulate my reaction. I was about to pull back onto the road when I heard a faint clicking sound. It came from the direction of the trees across the road. Slow, inconsistent clicks, like someone tapping metal lightly against metal. They weren't rhythmic, but they also weren't random. It reminded me of someone trying out unfamiliar tools. I shut the window. The clicking got quieter but didn't stop. I turned on the high beams, pointing them toward the tree line. Nothing, just pines and bare branches. But the clicking stopped the moment the high beams hit. I shifted in my seat, put the car in drive, and eased forward. For the first 100 yards, nothing happened. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone or something step into the road behind me. The headlights illuminated the asphalt in a long, bright stretch, uninterrupted. Then the reflection flashed again, this time off to the left. Not as bright, but unmistakably metallic. I slowed down again, but didn't stop. My pulse was hammering too hard. As I coasted past the spot where the flash had been, the radio crackled. I didn't even realize the radio was on. It had been silent for the whole drive. But it crackled sharply twice and then went dead again. Not static, not music, just two bursts of white noise. The dashboard lights dimmed for half a second. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles hurt. "Come on," I whispered to the car, or maybe to myself. "Just keep going." The rest of the road ahead looked clear. Nothing unusual, nothing metallic, but the air felt off. Heavier, denser, like I'd driven into a pocket where the atmosphere wasn't behaving right. I rolled the window down again, only an inch, just enough to hear the world. The river should have been loud, running full and cold this time of year. Instead, it sounded like it was farther away than it really was, like the road had pulled back from it. The clicking returned. This time, closer, much closer. Off to my right, not in the trees now, near the guardrail. Metal on metal, slow taps, almost curious. Instinct took over. I accelerated. Not dangerously, but quickly, like getting distance was the only thing that mattered. The clicking faded behind me, swallowed by normal road noise. The air pressure in the cabin eased, and my ears cleared as though I'd been descending a hill, even though the elevation was flat. After another mile, the headlights reflected off a normal road sign. That shouldn't have reassured me as much as it did, but it did. I finally exhaled. I kept driving, checking the mirrors constantly, waiting for the reflection to reappear or the radio to crackle again. But the road stayed empty, boring, familiar. The sky stayed black. The river sounded normal again. By the time the first lights of Noxon appeared in the distance, I'd convinced myself to keep going all the way home rather than pulling over. My hands didn't fully stop shaking until I was parked in my driveway. Inside, I sat down on the floor by the bed, not sure why, and tried to slow my breathing. Then my phone buzzed. A notification I'd never seen before. Motion detected ahead, 11:42 p.m. My phone didn't have any motion detection apps installed. It didn't have anything that should have triggered that kind of alert. I checked the timestamp, 11:42 p.m., exactly the minute I'd seen the first flash hanging in the air. The alert disappeared as quickly as it came, like it had never been real. When I tried to tap it, it was gone. I didn't sleep much that night. For days afterward, every reflective surface, not just metal, but glass, puddles, anything, made me stiffen. I kept expecting to see something hanging in the air, waiting to reflect the light back at me. It hasn't happened again. But now, every time I drive that stretch of Highway 200, I grip the wheel a little tighter as I round the bends, watching the air just above the road for something metallic, waiting for the light to catch on it again. I was sitting outside behind my apartment building when it happened. It was late September. The kind of night in Spokane where the air feels colder than it should because it's holding on to the last humidity of summer. I'd gone out to the back stairwell with a hoodie and a folding chair just to get some air. My place faces the parking lot, but the backside looks over a thin patch of trees and a wide slice of sky above them. It was around 11:15 p.m. No wind, no cars passing, just distant traffic hum and the occasional clang from the heating unit 2 floors up. I wasn't thinking about anything important, just staring at the cloud cover drifting low and slow. The clouds were thick enough that only a few brighter stars poked through. They moved in long streaks, barely changing shape. Then my ears popped. Not gradually, not like altitude change. A sudden, sharp pressure shift that hit both ears at once, the way they pop on an airplane landing. I straightened up immediately, swallowing hard. The air felt wrong. Heavy in my chest, like the atmosphere had compressed for no reason. At first, I thought a storm front was rolling in, but the clouds didn't look stormy. No wind picked up. The humidity didn't shift. Everything looked completely normal except for the pressure that made my skin prickle. I sat there froze, trying to figure out if maybe I'd stood up too fast, except I hadn't moved. That's when I saw the light. A dim, pale shape, barely brighter than the clouds themselves, slid horizontally between 2 breaks in the cover. It wasn't sharp or glowing. It looked diffused, like someone had smeared light across a patch of sky. But it was moving steadily, too steady to be lightning or aircraft lights reflecting off clouds. It glided like something behind the clouds was shining through them. I leaned forward in the chair, like gripping the edge of the seat. The pressure in my ears got worse for a second. The light continued drifting. No sound, no pulsing, just a smooth slide across a span of sky maybe 40 or 50 yards wide from my perspective. I expected it to dim or break apart as it met the next cloud bank. Instead, it paused. Just stopped. Light doesn't stop behind clouds. It should have kept diffusing, kept moving. But this patch froze exactly between two moving pieces of cloud down, holding shape while everything around it shifted. The clouds drifted. The light didn't. I felt my throat tighten. I didn't even blink. After maybe 2 seconds, maybe less, the light resumed moving, but now faster. It slid sharply upward and to the right, an angle too clean to be wind pushing anything. It moved so smoothly it made the clouds look jerky around it. Then it vanished. Not faded, vanished. One moment it was sliding along the underside of the cloud line. The next, there was nothing. No change in brightness. No dimming trail. Just gone. The moment it disappeared, the pressure in the air lifted. My ears popped again, this time releasing instead of compressing. I exhaled without meaning to. The normal sounds of the night returned immediately. The hum of the street, a dog barking blocks away, a car door slamming faintly in the distance. It felt like someone had unmuted the world. I sat there completely still, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. After a minute, I finally stood up, legs shaking a little. I looked around the backyard area, half expecting headlights, flashlights, anything, but all I saw were dumpsters. The fence line, the dim glow of the apartment hallway light leaking through the stairwell window. I checked my phone. The time said 11:24. That didn't make sense. Only a couple minutes should have passed. I hadn't been outside that long. I scrolled back to the lock screen. It still said 11:24. I thought maybe I misremembered the time earlier, but my phone battery had dropped 4% in what I swore was maybe 3 minutes at most. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, even though that didn't make much difference against something in the sky. But doing it made me feel better. I sat on my couch and tried replaying the movement in my head. The way it paused, the way it sped up, the angle. None of it matched anything I'd seen before. Not satellites, not aircraft, not drones, not weather phenomena. I pulled up a flight tracker app out of habit. Nothing was scheduled over my area. I checked the radar. No storms, no inversions. About 10 minutes later, I noticed something else. The pressure in my ears hadn't entirely gone away. There was still a faint tightness, like I'd just gotten out of an elevator that stopped too fast. Not painful, just wrong. I got up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out over the parking lot. A thin fog had started to roll in. Not heavy, just the kind that drifts low and clings to asphalt. The streetlights made little cones of pale yellow through it. For a moment I thought I saw the same dim light again reflected faintly in the fog, a soft smear sliding behind one of the streetlight halos. But by the time I focused on it, the smear was gone, leaving just the fog drifting normally. I stayed up later than I meant to. Every once in a while I'd test my ears by swallowing or tapping near my jaw, trying to get the pressure to stabilize. It never fully did until around 1 a.m. When it finally released, it did so suddenly, another sharp pop, followed by a rush of normal sensation. I didn't like that it ended the same way it started. The next morning, everything looked normal. Clear sky, ordinary clouds, temperatures in the high 40s. But while I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something odd on my phone screen. A push notification from the weather app, timestamped at 11:19 p.m. Atmospheric anomaly detected in your area. I tapped it. It didn't open anything. The notification blinked, then disappeared entirely. No record of it. No menu. Nothing. I tried searching online for similar alerts, but the weather service didn't list anything unusual. That night I sat outside again, earlier this time, around 8 p.m., trying to see if the sky behaved strangely when the clouds thickened. Nothing happened. The clouds looked normal. The air felt normal. My ears stayed normal. But when I stood to go back inside, I felt a faint, brief pressure change. Not as sharp as the night before, more like the ghost of the sensation. I froze and looked up immediately. Nothing in the sky. But for that split second, the night had felt thinner. I don't sit outside as often now. When I do, I keep my eyes on the spaces between clouds instead of the stars. And anytime my ears pop unexpectedly, even in an elevator or while driving over a hill, I find myself stopping, listening, waiting for the air to change again. just in case something is sliding behind the clouds, trying not to be seen. I heard the clicking for the first time about halfway down the old service road behind Pine Hollow Preserve. It was early November, already full dark by the time I'd finished work, but I needed a walk badly enough to ignore the fading daylight. The preserve wasn't far from my place in Laramie, 20 minutes by car, then a mile on foot if you took the unofficial access path, and I'd gone there enough times to know the trail by memory. The night was cold, but clear. My breath puffed out in little clouds that drifted sideways in the light breeze. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my boots and the distant rustle of dry grass. No animals yet. Too early for coyotes to start yipping. Too cold for insects. I'd walked maybe 5 minutes before I heard it. A quiet, clicking sound. At first, I thought it was something in my pocket. Keys hitting metal, zipper teeth tapping. I stopped walking and shifted my weight. Nothing clicked. I took another step, and there it was again. A light, deliberate tap, 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 like two smooth stones being knocked together. I stopped again. Silence. I looked behind me down the road. Nothing but the faint silver line of moonlight on the gravel. No movement. I stood there for a few seconds, listening hard, then shrugged it off and kept walking. The clicking returned almost immediately. Only this time it wasn't behind me. It was to my right, just beyond the tree line. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, patient. I turned my head toward the sound. It stopped the instant I looked. I stood still for a while, trying to convince myself it was a bird. Some kind of night bird I didn't know, or maybe a deer shifting its hooves on frozen brush. I told myself anything that sounded remotely plausible, even though none of those explanations felt right. I kept walking. After a minute, the clicking started again, now on my left side. The same rhythm, the same distance, maybe 30 feet away. When I spun my head in that direction, it cut off instantly, like someone had released a muted switch. My heartbeat picked up, but I forced myself to keep moving. This wasn't the place to panic. There were no large predators around here. And even if there were, predators don't make clicking sounds and then politely stop when you look at them. I walked another 50 yards, breathing slowly, watching the trees with the edge of my vision. The clicking resumed. This time it circled behind me first, then swept lightly to the right, pacing me. The sound was so faint, I wouldn't have heard it if the night hadn't been so still. The cadence changed occasionally, not random, not steady, more like someone testing different rhythms. I turned my head again, quick. Silence. A gust of wind moved the tall grass across the field, making a low whispering sound. The clicking didn't return for several seconds, and I thought maybe whatever it was had gone. Then it started again, closer than before. Tap, 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 tap. I felt my throat tighten. I sped up my pace, but didn't run. The service road wasn't dangerous, but suddenly it felt wrong. Too open, too quiet. The clicking kept circling, never overlapping itself, never stepping into view, always out of sight. I pulled out my phone to check the time. It was 6:43 p.m., but the battery icon was low, lower than it should have been after being fully charged that morning. At the same moment, the clicking stopped again. The silence that followed felt thick. I turned the flashlight on. The beam shot out over the gravel and trees, illuminating nothing but bare trunks and the knotty shadows between them. No glint of eyes, no movement. I stepped backwards slightly to steady myself, and the clicking started again, this time directly behind me. Tap. I whipped around, shining the flashlight. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No trees close enough for something to hide behind. No rocks. Just open ground, the path stretching straight back, empty. My chest tightened. I started walking again, faster now. Not running, just moving with that barely contained urgency of someone trying not to look scared. The clicking followed immediately, on my right, behind me, then on my left again. Every time I looked up, it vanished. Then something changed. The clicking paused mid-rhythm, not because I looked, because it wanted to. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The next sound wasn't clicking. It was a long, thin scrape, like something dragging lightly across tree bark. My flashlight beam wobbled in my hand. I aimed it toward the source of the scrape, and somehow, the trees looked different. Not physically, but the shadows between them felt deeper, thicker, like something was occupying a space that wasn't visible. My instincts screamed at me then, not because something jumped out or made a loud sound, just because the quiet was too intentional. I forced myself to look at the ground instead of the trees. My boots, the gravel, the faint track of tire treads from Forest Service trucks, the normal things. My breathing slowed slightly. Then the clicking resumed, but now it was above me, directly overhead, not in the branches, higher than that, in open air. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. The rhythm echoed strangely, muffled, as if it were bouncing off something not solid but present. I tilted the flashlight upward and aimed it into the gap between the clouds. Nothing. But the clicking didn't stop. It almost sounded playful now, small variations in tempo, like someone testing my reaction. "I'm leaving," I whispered out loud, not to anything specific, just to the road. The clicking stopped instantly. My stomach dropped. I didn't wait. I power walked toward the trailhead, looking straight ahead, refusing to look anywhere else. The air felt warmer suddenly, like the temperature had risen 5 degrees despite the cold night. I made it maybe 100 yards before the pressure in the air changed. Not like wind, more like the atmosphere thickened again. My ears popped softly and the hair on my arms lifted. The clicking returned. But now it was far away. Faint. Several yards behind me, like whatever had been circling me had drifted back into the trees. Not following anymore, but observing. I didn't turn around. I kept walking until I saw the faint glow of the streetlight at the edge of the lot. I stepped into the light and waited. The clicking stopped immediately, cut off mid-tap. The atmosphere returned to normal, cool, dry, still. I scanned the tree line once more. Nothing. Just the dark shapes of pine needles and branches swaying gently in a quiet breeze. When I reached my car, the moment I unlocked it, my phone buzzed. A notification appeared across the screen. Unusual audio pattern detected, 6:44 p.m., recording incomplete. I didn't have any app installed that would generate something like that. When I tapped the notification, it vanished. No recording. No history. The drive home was dead silent. I kept looking at the rearview mirror, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. That night, when I lay in bed, I heard a single faint click outside my window. Just one. Like a reminder. But it never repeated. I haven't gone back to Pine Hollow after dark since then, and whenever I walk anywhere at night, anywhere, I listen for that soft, deliberate tapping circling just beyond where the light reaches. I noticed the glow while I was loading my kayak onto the roof of my car. It was late spring, early May, and I'd driven out to the edge of the Mississippi near Winona to get a head start on the water before the wind picked up. I usually went alone and launched around sunrise, but that morning I woke up early, too early, and decided to just get moving. It was 4:52 a.m. I remember checking my phone because the time felt wrong. The sky should have been pitch black except for a thin gray line low on the horizon, but instead there was this soft orange glow spreading across the treetops on the far side of the river. It wasn't bright, just enough to make the silhouettes of the oaks look sharper. For a few seconds I thought I'd messed up the time, but the air was too cold for sunrise, and the birds hadn't started yet. Everything was quiet except the occasional slap of river water against the bank. The glow got brighter, not quickly, slow enough that I found myself staring without realizing it, waiting for the sun to peek over. The kayak strap dangled from my hand. I stood completely still, listening for anything that might give the moment context. A truck engine, a boat launching, a plane overhead, nothing. The glow spread higher, maybe 10 or 15 degrees above the horizon, a smooth, even curtain of orange-white light, too even. I've watched hundreds of sunrises on rivers and lakes, and they're never uniform. There are always streaks, gradients, shadows from clouds. This was just a clean wash of color. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how quiet the world felt. My breath sounded too loud in my ears. It's just early morning fog catching town lights, I thought. But there was no fog, and the nearest town lights were behind me. I set the strap down carefully and took a step toward the riverbank. The glow shifted. That's how I registered it, not as an object moving, but as light behaving in a way light shouldn't. It didn't slide sideways or flicker. It pulled upward, like someone gripping the top edge of the horizon and stretching the color vertically toward the sky. The hairs on my arms went up instantly. I blinked hard, expecting the illusion to break, expecting it to resolve into a cloud formation or a distant aircraft or anything logical. But the glow kept rising in one smooth pull, widening as it climbed. Then it folded inward. That's the only way I can describe it. The bright sheet seemed to collapse toward its center, like the light was being sucked through a narrowing gap. The horizon darkened as it retracted. The sky above swallowed the last traces of orange until all that was left was normal pre-dawn darkness. And then, as if someone hit pause on the world, everything stayed completely still. No wind, no sounds, no shifting leaves. The river surface went glass flat. I felt the quiet in my chest like pressure. I took one slow step back toward my car. My boots crunched lightly on the gravel, and the sound came back to me too sharply, like the air was thinner. The glow was gone. The sky looked normal again, dark blue near the water, fading to black. Nothing remained of what I'd just seen. Then something moved on the surfaces of the river. Not an animal, not a ripple. A thin streak of brightness flashed across the water, almost like moonlight catching on a moving object. But the moon wasn't out. The streak traced a shallow arc, maybe 30 feet long, then vanished. A deep, low buzzing fluttered in my ears. Not a sound exactly, more like a vibration behind my jaw. My vision tightened at the edges, the way it sometimes does when I stand up too fast, and for a moment the riverbank looked too bright, illuminated by nothing. I crouched without thinking, bracing a hand on the ground. The buzzing stopped, the brightness faded, everything was normal again. Damp grass, dark river, empty sky. I backed up until I felt the rear bumper of my car against my legs. My hand shook when I reached for the door handle. I got in and shut the door, breathing hard, watching the river through the windshield. Nothing moved. I waited there for several minutes, gripping the wheel, trying to talk myself into believing I'd seen something atmospheric, some kind of rare pre-sunrise reflection. But a few details wouldn't leave me alone. The upward pull, the uniform color, the way the glow vanished into itself instead of dispersing, and the silence, absolute silence. At 5:07 a.m., my phone buzzed. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was just a generic weather alert. Temperature drop expected. But the timestamp bothered me. My phone clock read 5:07, but it felt like far less time had passed since the glow disappeared. I hadn't lost time, but something about the minutes between 4:52 and 5:07 felt stretched. I watched the eastern horizon for normal sunrise. Around 5:20, the real color started to come in. Pale, uneven, familiar. The birds began their usual morning chorus. A fishing boat motored out from a private dock. The world switched back on like nothing had happened. I didn't launch the kayak. I drove home with shaking hands and watched the real sunrise from my apartment window instead. Later that afternoon, I checked my phone's photo gallery, even though I knew I hadn't taken any pictures. But there was something there. A completely black image time-stamped at 4:55 a.m. Not a pocket photo, not a screenshot, just a solid black frame with no metadata besides the time. I deleted it immediately, but the next morning when I woke up, the image was back. Same timestamp, same black frame. I deleted it again and turned the phone off for several hours. It stayed gone after that. I've never seen it reappear. Still, every time I go out before dawn, and I've done it only twice since, I find myself watching the horizon too closely, looking for that too even glow, listening for that heavy silence, waiting to see if it'll pull upward again and take something with it. I was lying on the hood of my car, parked off a turnout on the east side of Lake Oroville, when I noticed the star move. It was late August, hot even at night. The kind of heat that hangs in the air and makes every sound feel distant. I'd gone out there because the power was out in my neighborhood again, and sitting inside a dark apartment felt claustrophobic. Out by the lake, the sky was usually bright with stars, and I figured I'd stay an hour before heading home. The night was clear, except for a light band of haze drifting low over the water. I had the windows down, a lukewarm bottle of water next to me, and my phone dimmed to keep my eyes adjusted. I wasn't thinking about anything, just tracking the constellations, letting my brain drift. Star. There was a star near the edge of the Big Dipper that had caught my eye. Not brighter than the others, just slightly warmer in color. I stared at it for a while, mostly because everything else was too familiar, and this one felt new somehow. I thought maybe wildfire smoke was tinting it. Then it shifted sideways, just a tiny jump, not enough to be dramatic. More like the way something looks when you blink and realize you misjudged its position. I blinked again, harder this time. thinking maybe I was tired. The star stayed where it was. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and looked away for a second, focusing on the line of trees across the water. When I looked back, the star was still there, but something about it felt different, like it was trying to match the brightness of the stars around it and wasn't getting it quite right. I stared at it long enough that my eyes began to water. The moment I blinked, it shifted again. This time it moved smoothly. Just a slow drifting line to the left, barely noticeable unless you were already watching closely. I sat up on the hood, heart thumping a little harder now. A satellite, I told myself. A plane. Something logical. But planes don't move sideways like that, and satellites don't change direction. I kept watching. The star drifted for maybe 2 seconds, then stopped. Not a gradual stop, not a fade, an instant freeze. When it stopped, it looked exactly like every other star around it. Same brightness, same color, same stillness. I couldn't remember the exact moment when it stopped being a star and became whatever it was. I slid off the hood and stood beside the car, wiping my palms on my jeans. The air felt heavier now, like the pressure had gone up a little. A warm breeze came off the lake, but didn't make me feel any better. I tilted my head to look again, but the star hadn't moved since freezing in place. I reached into the car and grabbed my phone to take a picture. When I raised the phone, the screen flickered. Not a normal glitch, more like a slow dimming, then a sudden return to full brightness. It did it twice before I could even open the camera. I lowered it and the flickering stopped. I waited another minute before trying again. Same flickering. I set the phone down on the passenger seat and stepped away from the car entirely, maybe 30 feet. The gravel crunched under my shoes, echoing across the dry air. When I looked up a third time, the star was gone, not moved. Gone. The spot it had occupied was empty, swallowed by darkness. No faint afterglow, no slow fade, just missing. I whispered no under my breath, as if that would change anything. I scanned the sky for something moving, something out of place. But everything looked normal. The constellations were where they should be. The horizon was quiet. Then something flickered near the tree line across the lake. A brief glint, metallic like moonlight hitting a smooth surface. I froze. The trees were too far away for me to make out details, but the reflection had come from above them, not within the branches. I squinted, trying to see if it would happen again. Instead, I heard a low hum. Not loud, so low it was almost more sensation than sound. It vibrated in my ribcage, deep and faint, the way distant engines sometimes do. The hum lasted maybe 3 seconds, then faded. Right after it stopped, the star reappeared, not where it had been, much lower now, halfway between the top of the tree line and the cloudless sky. It appeared in a blink. One moment empty space, the next moment a single point of light glowing too steady to be a reflection. Every instinct in my body told me not to look directly at it, but I did. The star drifted upward this time, smooth and slow. It didn't follow a straight line. Its path wobbled slightly, like someone guiding it by hand and adjusting too late. The motion wasn't natural, not the smooth arc of a satellite or the soft drift of a balloon. It looked deliberate. I felt something tighten at the base of my skull. A pressure. Not painful, just present. Like awareness pointed back at me. I stepped backward until I hit the door of my car. My hand found the handle without me thinking, and I pulled it open, ducking inside. I kept watching the thing through the windshield, even as I fumbled for the ignition. When the engine started, the star froze again. Mid-drift, mid-wobble, just an instant stop. The pressure in my skull faded immediately. I didn't take my eyes off it. My hand hovered over the gear shift. The star blinked, not flickered, blinked. Off, then on, too fast and too clean to be anything atmospheric. The moment it blinked back on, it was farther away. Higher in the sky, smaller, retreating. I realized then I was shaking. My legs felt hollow, like I could collapse if I let myself. I put the car into drive and rolled forward slowly, keeping an eye on the sky and another on the narrow turnout road ahead. As the car moved, the star blinked again, then a third time. Each blink repositioned it higher, dimmer, farther, until finally it blended back into the sky, indistinguishable from the other stars. A perfect match. If I hadn't been staring directly at the spot, I never would have known anything changed. Once the star disappeared into normalcy, the night sounds returned. Crickets. A distant boat engine, a splash from the lake shore. The warm breeze cooled again. I drove home slower than usual, checking the mirrors constantly. Nothing followed, nothing moved. The sky looked ordinary. When I got home, my phone battery, which had been at 78% when I left, was at 22%. No apps had been opened, no calls made. A notification glowed across the screen for a split second before vanishing. Sky pattern interrupted, 10:41 p.m. I don't have any app that sends messages like that. I sat in my apartment for a long time, trying to decide if I'd imagined it. But every time I tried to replay the moment in my head, I failed to pinpoint exactly when the star stopped being a star. It shifted too seamlessly, too quietly. And now, every time I look at the night sky, I catch myself staring too long at whichever star looks slightly out of place, wondering if it's going to slide sideways again. It started around 1:30 in the morning. I'd been up late working on some edits for a small wedding shoot I'd done that weekend. Just me and a laptop in my home office. I live in a split-level house outside of Binghamton, New York. Not exactly rural, but right on the edge of some big open fields and woods that stretch for miles. At night, it gets quiet out here. Not country quiet, but close. A few houses scattered down the street, most with their lights off by 11. I remember because I'd just exported the final batch of photos and was shutting everything down when I heard it. This low, steady humming. At first, I thought it was something in the house, like maybe the fridge or the water heater kicking on, but it wasn't coming from any one direction. I walked into the living room, then the kitchen, and it was still there. Constant. No rhythm, no pulsing, just a flat hum. It wasn't until I stepped out onto the back deck that I realized it wasn't coming from the ground. It was overhead. The sky was clear that night, not a cloud in sight. You could see every star, even the faint ones near the horizon. But the moment I stepped outside, the humming got louder. Not painfully loud, just closer, dense. The kind of sound you feel in your teeth, like standing near power lines or under a giant engine that isn't quite running. I looked up, trying to spot a plane or something, but there was nothing, not even a blinking light, just stars and silence, except for that hum. And then, just like someone flipped a switch, it stopped, not faded, stopped. And that's when the quiet hit me. I mean, real quiet. No crickets, no wind through the trees, no distant highway noise. Nothing. I turned slowly, scanning the yard, the field behind the fence, the tree line. My own footsteps on the wooden deck sounded sharp and unnatural. Every breath felt too loud. I stood there for maybe a full minute, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. Then I saw it. Just above the treetops to the northeast, maybe 150 yards out, there was a light. A single, pale yellow orb, like a street lamp, but too high and with no pole or structure underneath. It hovered perfectly still. Didn't flicker, didn't sway, just there. I thought maybe someone had installed some new kind of light on the trail that ran along the back edge of the property, but it didn't make sense. There was no power out there. That trail was mostly used by deer and the occasional dog walker. No development had touched that land in decades. The weird thing was how it made the trees underneath it look. Not lit up, more like drained. Everything below it was washed out, like color had been pulled from the leaves and bark. My eyes started watering, like I was staring into something too bright, even though it didn't hurt. Then it started to move. Slowly, almost lazily, to the right. It drifted along the tree line at a walking pace, not bobbing or weaving, totally steady. I should have gone back inside. I knew that, but I couldn't make my feet move. After a minute or two, the light passed behind one of the taller oaks and didn't come out the other side. It just never emerged, like it blinked out behind the trunk and didn't keep going. The silence remained for maybe another 30 seconds. Then, all at once, the night sounds came back. Bugs, wind, a distant dog barking, like someone hit unpause on the world. I exhaled and realized I'd been holding my breath. I went back inside, locked the sliding door, and stood in my kitchen for a while just listening. Everything sounded normal. Too normal. I went to bed but didn't fall asleep for hours. The next morning, I went out to where I thought the light had hovered, just past the fence line, near a cluster of maple and pine. The ground looked normal at first, but when I got closer, I noticed the leaves were different in a circular patch about 12 feet across. They were brittle and lighter in color, like they'd been left under a heat lamp. A few small branches were curled inward like they'd shriveled from the tips. There were no burn marks, no footprints, nothing else unusual. I didn't touch anything. That night, I left the deck light on. I didn't go outside. Around the same time, a little after 1 a.m., the humming came back, just for a few seconds, then gone. Same thing the next night. Not as loud, not as long, maybe 5 seconds, then quiet. I stopped staying up late after that, set a strict bedtime, even left the TV on some nights. I didn't hear it again for a week. Then one night, I woke up around 3 a.m., no noise, just this strong feeling that something had changed. I went to the window and looked out at the backyard. There was a second patch now, almost the same size, maybe 20 feet from the first one. Same bleached, brittle leaves, same weird curl to the branches above, but I hadn't heard or seen anything that night, just woke up to find it. It happened one more time after that. Third patch, a little farther to the right, then nothing. I thought about getting trail cams, but something about the idea made my skin crawl. Like I wasn't supposed to document it. Like if I did, it'd escalate somehow. So I didn't. I still live here. It's been over a year now. The patches faded by fall, leaves grew in over them, grass came back. You can't tell anything ever happened if you don't know where to look. But I still do. Every time I mow the lawn, I drive a little slower over those spots, and sometimes late at night I mute the TV and just listen. I haven't heard the hum in months, but every once in a while I get this weird pressure in my ears, like I've just come up from underwater, and I wonder if it's starting again. I take the same route home from work every night. Highway 46, two-lane blacktop that cuts through the hills west of town. It's about 38 miles door to door, mostly farmland and patches of woods, a few empty gas stations, and one diner that closes at 9. I work second shift at a machine shop out by Brambleton, so I'm usually headed home a little after 10. That night was no different. I remember leaving the parking lot and waving to Mike, who was locking up behind me. I pulled out onto 46 with my usual cup of gas station coffee and my phone plugged in for music. The sky was clear, and the temperature had dropped, probably high 40s. I had the windows cracked just a bit to keep the windshield from fogging. I'd filled the tank halfway earlier that day, so I wasn't worried about stopping for gas. I never needed a full tank to get home. It was 10:12 when I last looked at the dash clock. I remember because the needle was right at the halfway mark on the gas gauge, and I thought to myself that I'd probably still have a quarter tank left by the time I pulled into my driveway. I don't know what happened after that. I don't remember zoning out or feeling tired or anything. I wasn't messing with my phone, and I hadn't touched the radio. It wasn't like I blacked out. There was no moment where I felt off or dizzy or whatever. But the next time I glanced at the clock, it said 11:03. My stomach dropped, not because of the time, but because I was already way past Newton's Crossing, almost to the Ridgemont overpass. That meant I had driven at least 15 miles without remembering a single thing about it. No landmarks, no turns, no hills, nothing. Just blink. I'm there. And the gas gauge was on empty. Not low, like the light was on and the needle was hugging the peg. I tapped the gauge like that was going to fix it, but it didn't move. I pulled off at the next turnout and put the car in park. The engine was running a little rough, and there was a soft hum I hadn't noticed before. Not from the engine, but more like a vibration through the car itself. Faint, but constant. I shut everything off and sat there for a second. The night felt too quiet. Normally, that area has crickets or frogs, especially with the fields nearby. But there was nothing. I rolled down the window a little more, thinking maybe I'd just missed it. Still nothing. No wind, no bugs, just silence. When I stepped out, the air felt off. It wasn't cold exactly, but it had that kind of pressure you get before a storm. Heavy. The car made a ticking sound as it cooled. I could hear my own breathing too clearly, and for some reason that really got to me. Like I was the only person around for miles. Maybe I was. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and walked around to the back of the car. There weren't any flat tires or leaks. I popped the gas cap just to double check. Still sealed. Everything looked fine, but the low fuel thing didn't make sense. I know what half a tank looks like. I'd only driven, 25 miles tops since filling it. There was no reason it should be near empty. That's when I noticed something weird about the dust on the back window. There were streaks, like something had touched it, not hands or anything like that, more like where condensation had wiped across it unevenly. But it wasn't wet, just clean in spots, like something had brushed against it and disturbed the dust in wide, curved lines. I got back in and turned the engine over. It started, but sluggish. I didn't want to risk running out of gas on the road, so I pulled up GPS on my phone to see how far the nearest station was. No signal. Not one bar. Which was strange, because I usually got full LTE on that stretch. I waited a few minutes holding my phone out like that would help, but nothing came back. I tried restarting it, but it froze on the lock screen. Just a black screen and the loading wheel, spinning like it was stuck. Something about the silence outside started to grate on me. I cracked the window a little more, just to feel like I wasn't trapped, and that's when I heard the sound. A low pop. Distant, maybe across the field. Then a second one, closer. Not gunshots or fireworks. It was more like a pressure sound, like when you open a vacuum-sealed jar, followed by this soft, whirring, almost like a drone, but not mechanical. More organic, if that makes any sense. It pulsed. I turned off the interior lights and just sat there, waiting. The whirring got louder, then stopped. Completely. Right in the middle of what felt like a beat. Then came a flash. It wasn't bright like lightning. It didn't light up the whole area. It was like a single point of white light just snapped on, maybe 100 feet away across the road in the ditch, low to the ground. Stayed there for half a second, long enough for me to see that there was nothing else around it. No vehicle, no movement. Then it blinked out. I sat frozen for what felt like a full minute. Then the car suddenly made a loud click. The kind it makes when you turn the key too far, even though I hadn't touched it. My phone lit up again. No signal still, but it was back on the home screen. I started driving, slow at first, not wanting to break down before I could find gas. But as I got closer to town, the fuel gauge started creeping up. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but by the time I reached the first lit intersection near Holloway Road, it was showing a quarter tank again. I didn't stop, I just kept going. Pulled into my driveway a little after 11:30. Killed the engine, sat in the dark for a minute, then went inside. I couldn't sleep that night. Kept checking the window, kept thinking I heard the whirring again, though I knew I didn't. My ears felt like they were ringing, but low, just below the edge of hearing. The next morning, I went out to check the car. Everything looked normal. The gas level stayed at a quarter. My phone had full signal again. But on the back window, those same streaks were still there. Clean arcs in the dust, like something had passed over it with soft pressure. I tried wiping them off with a cloth. They didn't smudge. They weren't oily or sticky, just there. Clean impressions. I washed the whole car that afternoon. Haven't taken 46 home since. I was heading home from a friend's place in central Nebraska one night in early September. I left Grand Island around 11:45 p.m., cruising west on Highway 30 toward Kearney. It was warm, humid even, and the night was clear with a half moon rising. I had the windows cracked, radio tuned to an oldies AM station. Nothing loud, just enough to keep me from drifting. The highway that time of night is nearly empty, especially outside of town. Long stretches of flat fields on both sides, occasional farmhouses way back off the road, silos and grain bins blinking red with aircraft lights. I was about 20 miles from home, thinking I'd stop for caffeine at a 24-hour diner just off the next exit, when I noticed something ahead. A light in the field to my right. At first, I thought it was a spotlight on a tractor or a pump jack, something stationary. But as I drew closer, it didn't look like any farm light I'd ever seen. It was pale, not yellow or orange like sodium vapor, more like a cold white. And it wasn't fixed on the ground. It seemed to hover maybe 10 feet above the stubble, right in the middle of a harvested cornfield. No support beams, no glow on the ground beneath it, just this bright, even oval of light up in the air. I slowed down a little to look, kept scanning for a vehicle, someone with a flashlight out there. But there was nothing. No truck, no person, no equipment. Just the light hanging over the field without a source. I found myself squinting at it through the windshield, and that's when the radio started crackling. At first, it was just tiny bursts, like someone was turning the dial through static. Then it filled the whole speaker, White noise layered with low pops, like a distant broadcast fighting to come through. I reached to turn the volume down, and that's when the engine hiccuped. I felt it in the seat, a quick stumble, like the car lost power for a fraction of a second. My foot was still on the gas, so it rolled forward, but then that hiccup happened again. The tachometer needle dipped, and the headlights dimmed a little. I glanced down at the dash. Nothing lit up, no warning symbols, just that slow blip in the RPMs. The light in the field didn't change. It stayed exactly where it was, perfectly still, like it was waiting. I eased off the gas and drifted past it, keeping my eyes on the road. The radio was still static, and the engine felt weird, like it was missing a beat every so often. But the car wasn't stalling. Not really, just sputtering. Then everything went quiet. Not silent, exactly. Just a sudden absence of noise that made the next moment stand out too sharply. The radio cut out, the engine smoothed out, the hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only thing left. I glanced in the rearview and saw the road behind me, nothing unusual. Then I looked at the odometer. I had passed the exit for the diner about 5 miles back. The next thing I really noticed was that I was parked on the shoulder about 10 miles past the light, hands still on the wheel, seatbelt clicked in, engine idling. I didn't remember turning off the highway. I didn't remember driving the 10 miles, just quiet, continuous motion straight ahead. It was like the memory of it didn't get saved in my head. I let the car idle there for a moment and tried to piece it together. Looked at the clock. It said 12:27 a.m. My phone showed full signal and no missed calls, nothing unusual in notifications. I turned the radio back on. Normal station, clear signal, no static at all. I snapped the gear into drive and kept going. About a mile up the road, there was a rest stop, so I pulled in. Parked under the lights, walked around outside for a bit, trying to remember if I hit my speed or the cruise control or anything that could explain the gap. But nothing fit. I hadn't braked, I hadn't turned off, I hadn't taken my hands off the wheel, and there was no record in my head of the miles in between. I thought about the light, about how sudden everything had changed once I passed it. I drove back toward where it must have been, parked and walked out into the field. But there was no sign of anything. No glow, no footprints, no tracks in the dirt, just empty stubble and the usual distant farm lights. I went back to the rest stop and looked at the field again from there through binoculars. Earth was flat and featureless, the way it always is this time of year. The horizon just blended into the sky, nothing moving, nothing unusual. Just the normal quiet of rural Nebraska at night. I sat in the car for a bit before turning back onto the highway. Coffee from a vending machine sipped while the engine warmed. The air smelled like cold asphalt and faint diesel. That drive home, nothing else weird happened. The radio worked. The engine stayed smooth. I remember thinking I had to be tired, or maybe the stress of work was catching up with me and my brain was playing tricks. But later that week, when I drove the same stretch of road at the same time, about midnight, I saw something odd again. Not the light, not a repeat of that night, just a pair of distant headlights pulled off on the same shoulder where I'd ended up, and out in the field where the light had been, there was this long patch of ground that looked like the snowplow blade had scraped last winter. A smooth, elongated mark that ended abruptly, right where those lights would have hovered. Nothing definitive, just a line in the dirt I couldn't explain. I parked a little ways past, looked back, and at that moment a breeze came up, rustling the cornstalk remnants in the field, and I drove on. I was coming back from my cousin's place in Lakeport, about 2 hours north of where I live in Ukiah. It was around 10:30 at night, early April, cool but dry, no rain in the forecast. I'd stayed later than I meant to and decided to take the back way home instead of the highway. Just figured I'd avoid traffic, not that there was much that time of night. I've driven that route more times than I can count. Highway 175 through the mountains, then cutting south on Hopland Road until it hooks into 101. It's winding and narrow in places, but peaceful. No streetlights, no businesses, just forest, some switchbacks, a few scattered ranch gates with cattle guards. I had music going low and one hand on the wheel, kind of zoned out but still paying attention. The moon was bright and the road was empty. Everything felt normal. I'd just past the big turnout with the rusted metal gate. I remember because I usually see deer near there, when the inside of my car started to glow. It didn't come from the dash or the dome light. It was this faint bluish-white glow, like someone had turned on a soft light under the seats. It filled the whole cabin evenly. Not bright enough to hurt my eyes, but it made everything look kind of washed out. I checked the dashboard. None of the lights were on. Headlights were still in low beam. I flipped the switch for the interior lights just in case. Nothing changed. Then the radio cut out, not like the volume dipped or the station changed. It just stopped. Screen still on, but silent. Then the instrument panel blinked. Once, the speedometer needle twitched down, then bounced back. The fuel gauge dropped to empty, then returned to 3/4. My GPS flickered off, then rebooted. I hadn't touched anything. I pulled my foot off the gas, coasting, hands tight on the wheel. I looked out the windows. No other lights on the road. No buildings, just trees on both sides and the occasional white reflector flashing past. That low glow inside the car didn't fade. It just stayed. And then I felt it. Not a sound, exactly. More like a pressure in the air, like when you drive into a tunnel or climb elevation too fast. My ears popped once, then again, and I could feel this tightness behind my eyes. My fingertips started to tingle, just slightly. The steering wheel got heavier. Not like it locked, just like it took more effort to turn it. I tapped the brakes and felt the pedal vibrate under my foot for a second, then go back to normal. Then the whole car shuddered, like it hit a pothole that wasn't there. And then everything just snapped back. The glow disappeared all at once. The radio came back on mid-song. The dashboard lights reset like I just turned the car on. The GPS lit up, showed my position, and that's when I noticed I wasn't on the same road anymore. I was on a straight 2-lane, smooth asphalt, lined with low brush and fencing on both sides. No trees, just flat, open terrain. I hit the brakes and slowed to a crawl, heart racing now. I looked around for anything familiar. It was dead quiet outside, no traffic, no wind, just the hum of my tires on pavement and the engine ticking under the hood. I pulled over to the shoulder and put it in park. Sat there, engine running, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I tapped the GPS. It said I was on Ore Springs Road, about 5 miles west of Ukiah. That didn't make sense. That road doesn't connect to 175. At no point had I made a turn that would have taken me there. It's not just a case of missing an exit either. To get where I was, I would have had to backtrack through at least one intersection and make a hard right, none of which I remembered doing. And I would have recognized the change in scenery. Trees don't just vanish. I opened the door and stepped out. The air was warmer here. I could smell dust like dry pasture. No wind. Just this heavy stillness, like the moment before a storm but without clouds. I walked a few steps from the car and turned in a slow circle. My headlights lit up the gravel shoulder and the edge of the wire fencing. Beyond that, just darkness. No houses, no cattle, no sounds. I stood there for maybe a minute, listening. I remember checking my phone for the time, 11:42 p.m. It had been 10:30 not long before. The whole drive, from where I'd been to where I was now, should have taken at least 30 extra minutes, maybe more. But I didn't remember any of it. Eventually, I got back in the car and headed the rest of the way home. I didn't turn the music back on. I just drove in silence, checking the mirrors way more than usual. When I got to my driveway, I sat for a second before shutting the engine off. The dash clock said 12:07. I stepped out, locked the car, went inside without turning on the porch light. My clothes smelled like road dust and pine. I checked my GPS history the next morning. It showed a clean line from Lakeport through 175, then a sudden gap and a new point starting from Ore Springs, like it had just jumped over a few miles of data. No errors, no signal lost, just missing time. I haven't used that back route again. Not because I think something will happen. I just don't like the idea of not knowing how I got somewhere. And I haven't seen that glow again. But every now and then, I'll be driving at night and catch a flicker out of the corner of my eye, like the cabin light's about to come on. And tighten my grip on the wheel, just in case. I woke up because I heard the little chirp from the home security app on my phone. It was 2:02 a.m. and the screen said, "Motion detected in backyard." I live in rural Boonville, up in the Arkansas Ozarks, not exactly a high crime area, but I keep a couple of cameras trained on the yard and driveway after someone stole my grill last summer. I didn't expect to see anything interesting at 2 a.m., much less this. I clicked the notification and watched the clip. It was almost pitch black in the yard, just shadows from the trees and the wooden fence. Then, for a split second, half a second really, the whole yard lit up, white, like someone had turned on a massive floodlight pointed straight down from the sky. There was no lightning, no sound on the clip, no thunder or thunderclap or crack or anything. Just that flash. The weirdest part was that there was no source in the frame. Not a drone, not headlights, nothing reflective that could have cast the light. Just the yard, bright as day for an instant, and then darkness again. The timestamp in the corner said 2147. I sat there trying to process it, replaying that tiny blip over and over. I looked out the bedroom window toward the backyard. No light, no glow anywhere. Just the normal silhouette of the fence and trees against a cloudy night sky. I figured maybe one of the critters kicked something into the frame and triggered the camera's motion sensor for just that flash. But that didn't make sense. Motion clips usually show whatever moved, even in the dark. This was just light with no apparent cause. I got up, put on socks and slides, and walked toward the kitchen to get a glass of water. Luna, my black lab mix, followed me close, nose down like she was tracking a scent. I checked the second camera, the one pointed near the back door. Nothing. No motion frame at 2:01. No light. Just normal darkness until 2:03 when the next motion clip triggered because the wind rattled the porch steps. I went into the backyard with a flashlight. The air was cool and humid like it always gets in early fall. Fog was lying low along the ground, thin and creeping. The ground was damp where the sprinkler system had run earlier that night. I scanned the yard and the trees. Everything was normal, nothing out of place, no trampled grass or disturbed soil. I even checked the grill area, which was where the previous break-in stuff happened. Nothing, not even footprints, just ordinary darkness and shadows. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that white flash, like I was looking at it from the outside, not from the camera. In the morning, I showed the clip to my neighbor, Warren. He's an electrician by trade, used to CCTV and all that. He watched it with me in my living room the better part of breakfast. "That looks like a saturation clip," he said, pointing at the screen on my laptop. Camera sensors can do weird things with noise and bright spots. I asked him if a reflection or a passing car might have done it. He said no. There's no reflective surface in that yard that could produce that, and no light source off screen. Could be a sensor glitch, but half a second is odd. You don't usually get that clean global flaring from a random glitch. I nodded, but it didn't satisfy me. I knew what I saw, a flash of light, no lightning, no sound. It felt too real for a sensor error. That night, I left the porch lights on. At around 11:30 p.m., I stepped outside to take out the trash. The air was heavy and warm, like summer forgotten to quit. The crickets were loud, and a half moon hung low over the trees. I watched Luna sniff around the grass. She didn't bark, didn't flinch, just wandered, tail low, ears perked a bit. I noticed a flicker from the camera housing, a tiny green LED that blinked when it was recording. I looked up at the sky and thought I saw something, just beyond the tree line, a faint glow that didn't match any star. It wasn't a shape, not really, just this slight pale tint against the night. I blinked, and it was gone. I finished my trash chore and went back inside. That uneasy feeling in my chest stayed with me, like something had brushed past the edge of my awareness even without a sound. Later that night, around 1:17 a.m., I woke again. This time, my phone wasn't buzzing. I just woke up. I looked at the clock on my nightstand, just a dim red 1:17, and listened. The house was quiet. Even the old HVAC unit outside seemed silent. I reached for my phone out of habit and then realized the screen was glowing faintly on its own. I hadn't touched it, but the lock screen was lit up bright. I checked the time again. Same. It wasn't charging, nothing was going on, just lit. I turned it over and the screen went dark. I lay there for a long time, waiting. No noise, no lights, no notifications, just the quiet buzz of electric in the walls. Morning finally came. I checked the backyard camera again. There was another clip at 1:16 a.m., but this one was only half a second long, similar to the night before. I watched it and saw that same yard lit up, bright and white, but this time there was something subtle at the very edge of the frame, a slight shadow moving across the grass. It wasn't clear, more like a blur, just enough that I squinted and rewound it a few times. I showed that clip to Warren too. He just shrugged and said it might be noise from a low-light sensor reacting to nothing. But I didn't think it was just noise. There was something in that blur. Not a distinct shape, not a creature, not a person. Just movement that wasn't like the wind. A few nights later, I kept all the lights inside on and didn't check the cameras. I just tried to sleep through it. I woke at 3:02 a.m. to silence. I checked the porch light through my blinds. It was steady, same as before. No flash, no motion alert. It was peaceful. I fell back asleep. The next morning, I checked the footage. The camera by the fence logged motion at 3:01 a.m. Again, another half-second clip, same bright white yard. No sound, nothing visible except that flood of light. No blur this time. Just the yard, bright as day, and then nothing. I replayed that split second dozens of times. I cropped it, I adjusted contrast, I looked for any hint of movement, any sign of what could have caused that light. Nothing reliable. I talked to a couple coworkers about it later in the week. One joked about a satellite reflection. Another suggested a power grid fluctuation. They all had ideas. None of them fit what was in the video. The weird thing is, the rest of the footage that night, the hours before and after, was ordinary. Nothing. No animals, no cars, no shifting lights among the trees. Just darkness, like always. When I step outside at night now, I find myself looking up at the sky more than the yard. Not watching for flashes, not expecting anything, just checking the emptiness above. I stand there a little longer than I used to, breathe a little deeper, and then go back inside. But I check the cameras every morning, every single morning. And every day, I play those half-second clips. Hundreds of frames stretched into a blink that makes the yard as bright as day. Nothing else shows in them yet, just the light and the quiet. I was hiking alone in Allegheny National Forest just for the day. It was mid-October, that sweet spot before the real cold sets in, but the leaves are already past peak color. The trail I was on isn't exactly well known, part of an old logging road that gets less traffic than the main loops. I found it through a guy I work with, Josh, who hikes up there all the time. He marked it out for me on Gaia and said it was worth it if I wanted a quieter route. I started around 11 a.m. and planned to do maybe 8 or 9 miles out and back, with lunch at a creek Josh mentioned about halfway in. I had my pack, water, snacks, and a Garmin. Signal was spotty, but I had a good GPS lock the whole time. It was quiet, but not dead. Birds, wind, the usual underbrush noises, nothing spooky. About 5 miles in, maybe a little more, I stopped for a break. There was a downed tree off the trail, and I sat on it to eat some peanut butter crackers and drink water. I remember the sun was right overhead, and I checked my watch. 1:34 p.m. I was making good time. I got moving again about 10 minutes later. Trail narrowed as it followed a ridgeline, climbing just a bit. I remember the incline because I was breathing harder and had to shed my fleece. I was stuffing it into the side pocket of my pack when I noticed something odd. The birds had stopped. I didn't register it fully at first. I was just zipping the pocket up and realized there was nothing else. No wind in the trees, no leaves rustling, no insects. I stood there for a second, one hand still on my pack strap, and listened. Nothing. It wasn't like the forest was quiet. It was like it had been muted. No distant woodpeckers, no chipmunks rustling leaves. It felt like standing in a photograph. That's when I noticed the pressure. Not on my ears, exactly. More like a fullness, like when you're deep underwater or in a car with the windows up and someone slams a door. Not painful, just wrong. I took a couple steps forward, listening hard. My boots didn't even seem to crunch the leaves the way they should have. I stopped again. Then, above the trees, through a break in the canopy, there was a flash. Not lightning, no clouds. It was a pale light, maybe the color of a halogen bulb, and it pulsed twice. Not blinding, not even very bright, but definitely there. Just 2 short pulses, spaced maybe a second apart. I looked up, squinting, but didn't see anything after that. No object, no movement. The light had seemed diffused, like it didn't come from a point, but from everywhere above the trees at once. Then, just as quickly, the sounds came back. all at once. Birds, wind, insects, everything, like someone had flipped a switch. I remember gasping like I'd been holding my breath. I hadn't even realized it. I pulled out my phone, not because I thought I'd find anything, but just to check the time. It said 1:52. I hadn't walked more than 5 minutes from my last break. I knew that. It should have been 1:40, maybe 1:42. I checked the GPS track. Still locked in. Still on the same trail. No drift. I kept walking. I don't know why, exactly. Part of me wanted to turn around, but it felt like if I stayed in that spot, something else might happen. Like the air was still waiting for something. So I walked. The next half mile was normal. I passed through a patch of beech trees and came to the creek Josh had told me about. A narrow, rocky stream, maybe 20 feet wide, shallow enough to cross on foot. I sat there for a while and tried to forget about what happened. Told myself I'd just spaced out and maybe the light was a reflection off something. But that pressure feeling didn't fully go away. I turned around not long after that. I didn't finish the full loop. The whole hike back, I kept glancing up through the trees, expecting another pulse. It never came. But about 2 miles from the trailhead, something else happened. I passed a section I definitely remembered. This big rock with a tree growing sideways out of it, roots wrapping down like tentacles. I'd passed it on the way in. I'd even taken a photo of it for my wife because she likes weird trees. Only now, the tree looked different. Same shape, same position, but the leaves were the wrong color. Not yellow like before. Bare, like it had shed everything in the last 2 hours. I pulled out my phone and checked the photo. The timestamp said 12:18 p.m. The tree was full of leaves. That wasn't even 3 hours earlier. I stood there for a while trying to rationalize it. Maybe I was misremembering. Maybe I took the photo somewhere else. But I knew I hadn't. I started walking faster. When I got back to my car, everything looked normal. A couple other vehicles in the lot, sun still up, wind had picked up a bit. I checked the time again, 3:37 p.m., and my phone was hot. Not just warm. Hot like I'd been using GPS, music, and video all at once in the sun for hours. I hadn't. I'd used it maybe 5 times the whole hike. The battery had dropped to 18%. I'd left home with it at 100%. When I got home, I plugged it in and checked the GPS log again. The track looked fine. No jumps, no gaps, but when I zoomed in around the spot where the light had pulsed, there was a short stretch, maybe a quarter mile, where the pace data just vanished. Not slow, not fast, just blank. Like it didn't register movement at all. I didn't tell Josh about that part, just said I cut the hike short because I was tired. I still go hiking, but I haven't gone back to that trail. I didn't notice the audio file until almost noon the next day. I'd been working from home, half distracted, going through emails on my laptop when I got a notification from my phone that storage was running low. I tapped into it, thinking I'd just delete a few videos or clear out the downloads folder, but there was this one file near the top of the list I didn't recognize. Audio 0014.m4a, 14 seconds long, created at 3:12 a.m. That caught my attention right away because I hadn't been awake at that time. I don't have any kind of sleep recording app, never installed anything like that. I checked again to see if it was a leftover file from something else, maybe a voice memo from work, or something I'd accidentally recorded earlier in the day. But the timestamp was specific, 3:12 a.m. that night. It wasn't labeled by an app, just a raw audio file in the internal recordings folder, which I never use. I put on headphones and hit play. For the first few seconds, it was mostly static. Not loud, more like distant white noise. There were faint background hisses and pops, almost like an old analog recording, except I don't own anything that would make that kind of sound. Then about 4 seconds in, there was a click. Then another, soft, not mechanical, not like a switch, more organic, like 2 wet fingernails tapping together, if that makes any sense. Click, 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 perfectly spaced, a short pause, then the pattern again. Maybe 5 or 6 in total before it stopped. Then just more static until the file ended. I played it 3 times thinking maybe I was hearing it wrong. The rhythm didn't change. It wasn't interference. It felt intentional. I didn't sleep well the night before, but I hadn't thought much of it. I'd gone to bed around 11:30 and woke up groggy at 7. I do remember waking up once in the dark and checking the time on my phone. It was just after 3 a.m., I think. I had this vague sense that something had stirred me, but there wasn't any noise. Just that off feeling you get sometimes, like something had just stopped. I live alone in a duplex outside Flagstaff. One story, nothing fancy, tucked up against the backside of a hill. My bedroom's at the back of the house, no windows facing the street, just one small one that looks out toward a patch of scrub pine and the slope beyond. I keep my phone on the nightstand. It's always in do not disturb mode overnight with no voice assistant, nothing that should be listening for commands. And like I said, I don't use sleep apps. I checked battery history. Nothing showed as active at that time. No media apps, no system log of anything happening around 3:12 a.m., just the file. I thought maybe I'd rolled over and hit the screen somehow. But even then, how would the recording app have opened? I tested it. It took 3 taps just to get to it, and the file name it saved didn't match how the native voice recorder usually labels things. I don't know why, but the clicking stuck in my head all day. I kept hearing it in the back of my thoughts. Not loud, just there. I finally told myself it must have been a glitch or something from outside, maybe a raccoon or a branch tapping the side of the house. That night, before I went to bed, I opened the window a crack just to see if anything outside could be making that sound. I stood there in the dark for a minute. Nothing. Just a few crickets, the wind through the trees. No clicks. I turned off the light and got into bed. I charged the phone in the exact same place on the nightstand. When I woke up the next morning, there was another file. Audio 1/5.m4a. 3 a.m. I didn't play it right away. I stared at the file name for a while. Just the fact that it was there made my stomach tighten. Same size. 14 seconds. Eventually I put on the headphones. Same static, same faint background hiss. Then the clicking, but it was closer this time. Louder, still soft but more pronounced. Same rhythm. Click, click, click. And right at the end there was a pause. Then one final click, louder than the rest, almost sharp. Then silence. I pulled the headphones off. I didn't sleep the following night. I left the bedroom light on. I kept the phone unplugged. I deleted the previous files, put the phone in airplane mode, closed every app, powered it off completely. When I woke up, it was back on. Battery at 74%. Last activity 3:09 a.m., and there was a new file, audio 06.m4a. 14 seconds. I didn't listen to that one right away either. I sat in the kitchen for half an hour just staring at the screen. Then I played it. The static was lighter this time, almost silent, and there were no clicks. Not right away. There was just breathing. Faint, ragged, like someone standing just far enough from the mic to barely register. A long exhale, then another. Then the clicking started. One click, another, then nothing. The file cut off before the 14-second mark. Just ended mid-hiss. That was the day I called my sister. I didn't say everything, just told her I'd been hearing weird things at night, and I wasn't sleeping well. She offered to let me stay over, but I brushed it off. Told her I was probably just stressed. I went for a long drive that afternoon, just to clear my head. I left my phone on the passenger seat the whole time, screen facing down. When I got home around 5 p.m., there was a new notification. The voice recorder had tried to launch itself at 3:11 p.m. while I was driving, while the phone was locked and untouched. No file this time, just the attempt. That night, I left the phone in the kitchen. I shut the bedroom door and turned on a white noise machine, put my watch in airplane mode, powered everything else off. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. fully alert. Not panicked, just awake. I couldn't hear anything. The house felt quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I sat up, not moving, just listening. There were no clicks, no breathing, no sounds at all. I stayed that way for a while. Then finally I got up and walked out to the kitchen. The phone was on. New file, audio 0017.m4a. This one was 14 seconds like the others. Timestamp 3:12 a.m. I took a breath, sat down at the table, and played it. No static this time, just one sound, repeating, very slow, very clear. It was the sound of my bedroom door opening. Hinge creak, light wooden shift, a faint click as it swung. Then, nothing. The door had been closed when I woke up. I'm sure of that. I don't know how the phone recorded it. I don't know what's been triggering it. I checked for malware, factory reset the whole device, wiped everything. I started sleeping with the phone off and sealed in a drawer. No new recordings since then. But sometimes, just after 3 a.m., I wake up anyway and lie there, listening. It was a re-dye from Seattle to Minneapolis. I'd booked it last minute to get home for my brother's engagement thing, just one of those dumb family get-togethers where everyone pretends they haven't seen each other's social media updates already. The flight left a little after 11 p.m., and I had the window seat back in row 22. The plane wasn't full. The guy in the middle seat next to me, late 30s maybe, cargo jacket, earbuds in. Didn't say a word the whole time. Just nodded when I slid past him to the window. I think his name was Dan or Dave or something. I saw it on the boarding pass when he held it up to the flight attendant. Anyway, we took off on time. The lights in the cabin dimmed, and most people started dozing as soon as we leveled out. I had my tray down, laptop open, pretending to work. I couldn't focus, so I shut it and leaned against the window with my sweatshirt pulled up to block the draft. It was clear outside, that high-altitude kind of clear where the stars looked pinned to the sky. Not much to see below, just a scattering of lights from whatever towns we were flying over and patches of dark that could have been fields or forest. The wing was lit faintly by the plane's running lights, and I remember thinking how quiet everything felt, even with the drone of the engines. Maybe an hour in, I noticed the light. It was outside the window, past the wing. A steady white light, maybe the size of a golf ball from my perspective. No blinking, just there, matching our speed exactly. At first I figured it was a star or a reflection. Planes can do weird things with glass and angles. But I shifted in my seat, leaned back, leaned forward. Didn't matter. The light didn't move. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't something inside the cabin. It was out there. And it was keeping pace with us. Same altitude, same direction, just hovering beyond the wingtip. I stared at it for a while. Minutes. It didn't change brightness or color. It didn't drift. It didn't flicker. And the longer I watched it, the more I realized how wrong it was. We were going hundreds of miles an hour at 35,000 feet. Nothing just hangs like that. I glanced at the guy next to me. Still had his earbuds in, eyes closed, arms folded. I turned back to the window. The light was still there. Something about the way it stayed exactly the same distance, same position, started to really mess with me. It wasn't acting like any aircraft I've ever seen. No blinking lights, no engine noise, no shape. Just this cold white glow, perfectly smooth. I reached down slowly and nudged the guy's arm. He opened one eye halfway and looked at me. I motioned toward the window. "I think there's something out there," I said, keeping my voice low. He pulled out one earbud and leaned slightly to look. The second he shifted forward, before he could even really see anything, the light darted. It didn't fade or veer off or descend. It moved so fast it left a streak in my vision, like it had been slingshot out of place. It shot upward at a steep angle and was gone. Just gone. The sky was empty. "Never mind," I said quietly. The guy gave me a weird look and leaned back without a word. I turned back to the window and sat there staring out into the black for a long time. Nothing else showed up. Eventually I leaned back and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. My ears were ringing, which sometimes happens when I'm anxious. That kind of too quiet silence where the air feels thick. I checked my watch more times than I should have. We landed in Minneapolis a little before 5 a.m. Everyone shuffled off the plane like zombies. I didn't say anything to the guy next to me. I didn't tell anyone about it. What would I even say? I looked up commercial flight info later. There were no other planes reported near ours at that time. No drones, no weather balloons, nothing that matched what I saw. I still don't know what it was, but I know it was there. And I know it knew when I noticed. The power went out while I was rinsing a mug in the sink. The kitchen lights cut off so cleanly that for half a second, I thought I'd blinked and missed something. The refrigerator stopped humming. The house settled into that quiet you only notice when it's forced on you. I stood there with my hands still under the tap, water running, until I realized the pump would probably cut too. I shut it off and listened. No distant traffic, no neighbor's TV through the walls, just my own breathing and the faint tick of cooling metal somewhere in the house. This kind of outage wasn't rare where I lived. I rented a small place on the edge of town, backed up to open fields and a line of trees that marked the start of state land. Storms knocked the power out a few times every summer. But this night was clear. No wind, no clouds. I'd been sitting on the couch 10 minutes earlier with the windows open because it was still warm out, listening to cicadas. I walked to the living room window and looked outside out of habit. The streetlights were off, all of them, down the entire road. Usually at least one house would still have a generator running, but everything was dark. My car sat in the driveway as a low shape, barely visible. That was when I noticed the sky. At first, I thought my eyes were just adjusting too fast. The sky looked wrong in a way I couldn't pin down immediately. It wasn't black like it should have been. It wasn't even that deep blue you get on clear nights. It was lighter, flat, almost reflective. I stepped out onto the porch. The sky had turned a dull silvery gray. Not glowing, exactly. More like the color of metal when it catches light, except there was no light source, no moon, no clouds reflecting city glow. The whole sky from horizon to horizon looked washed out and heavy, like a ceiling. The fields behind my house were still dark. The trees were dark, the ground was dark. It was just the sky. I remember thinking it looked close, lower than it should be. I stood there barefoot on the concrete, my hand resting on the doorframe. The air felt still but not calm. There was pressure in it, like when a storm is about to break but hasn't yet. My ears felt faintly clogged, the way they do when you drive up a mountain too fast. Somewhere down the road, a car door slammed. The sound carried farther than it should have. I glanced to my left and right, half expecting to see neighbors outside, pointing, talking. But no one else was out. No porch lights flicked on. No voices. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. The screen lit up normally, full signal. No emergency alerts. The time looked right. I lifted it to take a photo, more out of instinct than anything else. Before I could tap the camera, the sky changed. It didn't fade gradually. It didn't flicker. The silvery gray pulled upwards, straight up, like a curtain being lifted from the horizon to directly overhead. The motion was smooth and fast. In less than a second, the sky was dark again. Normal. Stars visible. Empty. I stood there with my phone half raised, staring at nothing. A moment later, the streetlights snapped back on. One by one, all down the road, my porch light came back without me touching the switch. Inside, the refrigerator kicked on. The house filled with noise again. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than 5 seconds. I stayed outside longer than I meant to, scanning the sky, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The stars looked normal. The air pressure eased, or maybe I just stopped noticing it. Eventually, I went back inside. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up and checking the time, listening for changes in the house. The power stayed on. Nothing else happened that night. The next morning at work, I mentioned the outage to my coworker Mark while we were getting coffee. "Did the power go out where you are?" I asked. He shrugged. "Not that I noticed. I was up late too." I asked a few other people. Some had lost power, some hadn't. No one mentioned the sky. That should have been the end of it. I told myself it was some weird atmospheric thing or my eyes playing tricks on me in the dark. I let it go, mostly. Then it happened again. About a week later, same time of night, around 10:30, I was sitting on the couch, lights on, scrolling on my phone. The power cut out so abruptly that my TV went black mid-sentence. This time I felt it before I saw anything. That same pressure in the air, like the room had sealed itself. I stood up immediately and went to the window. Outside, the streetlights were already off. The sky had already changed. That same dull gray filled the view, uniform and heavy. It didn't shimmer. It didn't move. It just sat there, wrong. I didn't go outside this time. I stood in the doorway, barefoot on the rug, gripping the frame harder than I realized. I checked my phone. No signal now. The screen showed 0 bars. The time still ticked forward. I tried the camera anyway. The screen showed the gray sky, but flatter than it looked to my eyes, like it couldn't quite capture it. I noticed then that it was quiet in a different way. Not just no electricity. The insects were gone. No crickets. No distant dogs. Nothing. I became very aware of how alone my house was. The sky lifted again, exactly the same way. Upward, smooth, fast. Darkness returned. Stars snapped back into place like someone had flipped a switch. The power came back a few seconds later. This time I checked my phone immediately. The signal returned. No missed alerts, no messages. The photo I thought I'd taken wasn't there. I slept on the couch with the lights on. After that, I started paying closer attention. The outages weren't on any schedule I could find, but they were always at night, always clear weather, always quiet. On the third time I was outside already, sitting on the porch with a beer. I felt the pressure shift and looked up just as the sky changed. I watched it without moving, forcing myself not to blink, trying to notice details. There were no clouds, no texture. The gray wasn't light coming from somewhere. It was like the absence of darkness. I realized something else then. The horizon line stayed where it was. The trees didn't silhouette against the gray. It was like the sky and the ground weren't interacting the way they normally did. My phone lost signal again. The screen dimmed slightly on its own. The sky lifted. The lights came back. I noticed my hands were shaking. I started checking local outage reports. Sometimes there was nothing listed at all. Sometimes there'd be a vague entry. Brief interruption. 'Cause unknown. I drove around one night after it happened, just to see if it was localized. The town looked normal. Lights on, people out, no gray sky. When I drove back toward my place, everything stayed normal. The next time it happened, I was in the shower. The water cut off mid-rinse. The bathroom went silent except for the ringing in my ears. I stepped out dripping and went to the window in a towel. The sky was already gray. That time, it lingered longer. Long enough for me to notice something else. The stars didn't disappear. They were still there, but dimmer, like they were being seen through a layer of frosted glass. I thought I saw movement up there. Not a shape, just a subtle shift, like something passing behind the gray. I didn't look away. The sky lifted. Everything came back. I checked the clock afterward. The power had been out for 7 minutes. I couldn't remember standing at the window for that long. The last time it happened was the one that finally pushed me to write this down. I was asleep. I woke up because the house felt wrong. That pressure, again, heavier than before. My ears rang softly. I sat up in bed and realized the power was off. I went to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The sky was gray. But this time, it wasn't uniform. There was a subtle gradient, darker in one area, like a shadow behind it. I felt watched in a way that didn't come from a direction I could point to. I stepped back from the window. The floor felt faintly warm under my feet. The sky lifted. The lights came back. I stood there in my bedroom, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the shadow. The next morning, my neighbor across the road asked me if my power had gone out again. I said, "Did you see the sky?" He frowned. "What sky?" I didn't push it. The power hasn't gone out again since. Weeks have passed. Everything looks normal, but now some nights when it's clear and quiet, I'll catch myself staring up at the stars, waiting for them to dim, waiting for the gray to come back down. And sometimes, for just a second, the sky looks thinner than it should be. The radio cut to static right as the light turned red. Not the quick crackle you get driving under power lines, but a flat, empty hiss, like someone had muted the world and left the volume up. I reached over and tapped the power button, thinking the unit had frozen, but nothing changed. Then a low tone slid in under the static. Not loud, just steady. A single note that felt like it was sitting behind my eyes instead of in my ears. I took my foot off the gas and let the car roll the last few feet to the line. It was late, a little after 11 p.m., and I was on Cedar Hollow Road, the one with the four-way intersection by the closed hardware store and the old diner that never reopened after the fire. Fog had rolled in earlier, thin but persistent, turning every streetlight into a fuzzy halo. I remember thinking the night felt quieter than usual. No insects, no distant traffic hum, just my engine and that tone. I looked up when the tone dipped slightly, like it was breathing. Above the intersection, maybe 20 or 30 feet up, there was a dim light. Not bright, not sharp. It was the color of a match seen through frosted glass. It hovered there for less than a second. No movement, no flicker, just present. Then it was gone. At the exact moment it vanished, the tone stopped. The radio snapped back to the song that had been playing before, mid-chorus, like nothing had happened. The fog looked the same. The streetlight hummed. My dashboard clock hadn't changed. The light turned green. I sat there long enough for someone behind me to honk. I drove the rest of the way home on autopilot, checking the rear view every few seconds without knowing why. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. It felt too small, too easy to explain away if I tried hard enough. Electrical interference, fatigue, some reflection in the fog. That's what I told myself while brushing my teeth, while locking the door, while lying in bed listening to the house settle. But the next night, it happened again. Same intersection, same time window. This time I was ready. I turned the radio off before I got there. I slowed down well before the light, heart thumping harder than it should have. The fog was thicker, pooling low to the ground. The light went red. The tone started anyway. It didn't come from the radio. The speakers were silent. I could feel it in my chest, like standing near a generator. My teeth buzzed faintly. I looked up. The light was there again, in the same spot. Same size, same dull color. It didn't cast a shadow. It didn't reflect off the windshield. It didn't seem to interact with anything at all. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking, but by the time I unlocked it, the light was gone. The tone cut off so abruptly it made my ears ring. The radio stayed off. The light turned green. I drove through the intersection and pulled over a block later, breathing hard, checking the video I'd accidentally recorded of my lap in the steering wheel. No sound, no glow, just me swearing under my breath. I took a different route home after that. Longer, darker, but it felt safer. Except the third night, the tone found me anyway. I was stopped at a different light, closer to my place, when the static crept in again. This time it didn't replace the music. It slid underneath it, warping the sound until the song slowed and bent like a tape dragged across a magnet. I slapped the radio off and the static kept going. I looked around, no light this time, just fog and empty sidewalks. The tone followed me all the way home, fading only when I pulled into my driveway. The second I shut the engine off, the night rushed back in. Crickets. A distant car. Normal sound. I barely slept. Over the next week, patterns started to form whether I wanted them to or not. The tone only happened when I was stopped. Red lights, stop signs, idling in traffic. It never started while I was moving. The light always appeared overhead, never close enough to touch, never far enough to feel like a star. It never stayed long. I tried not to look up after the fourth time. I kept my eyes forward, hands clenched on the wheel, telling myself that if I didn't see it, it couldn't be real. The tone still came. It seemed to last longer when I refused to look. One night, at the same intersection as the first time, the tone didn't stop when the light turned green. I drove anyway. The moment the car rolled forward, the tone slid higher like a pressure change in an airplane cabin. My vision blurred at the edges. The fog ahead of me glowed faintly, not lit from within, but washed thin, like something bright had just passed through it and left a residue. I don't remember crossing the intersection. The next clear memory I have is braking hard 2 blocks later, my heart hammering, my hands numb. The radio was off, the tone was gone. The clock said 11:47. I checked my phone. I had left work at 11:12. The drive usually took 10 minutes. I started paying attention to time after that, writing it down, taking photos of my dashboard, setting my phone to record audio when I drove at night. Nothing ever showed up in the recordings, no static, no tone, just road noise and my breathing. But the gaps kept happening, always short. 2 minutes, 3 at most, always when the tone appeared. I told my sister Mara about it over coffee one morning, leaving out the parts that made it sound insane. I talked about losing time, about zoning out at lights. She asked if I was sleeping enough, if work was stressing me out. She suggested I see a doctor. I almost believed her until the night she rode with me. We were coming back from the grocery store, bags in the back seat, when we hit a red light on Oak Ridge. I hadn't even noticed the intersection before the static started. Mara frowned and tapped the radio. Is it broken? The tone slid in. She went quiet. I didn't look up. I didn't want to know if the light was there. Do you hear that? She asked. I nodded. The car felt heavier, like the air had thickened around it. My ears rang. The static drowned out everything else. Mara whispered my name. I glanced up despite myself. The light hovered above us, closer than before. Close enough that I could see its edges weren't sharp. They wavered like heat shimmer, except there was no warmth. Just a sense of pressure, like something leaning down. Mara sucked in a breath. That's not. The light vanished. The tone stopped. The radio came back on at full volume, making us both jump. The light turned green. We sat there until someone honked. Mara didn't say anything the rest of the drive. When we got to my place, she hugged me too tightly and told me to call her if it happened again. She didn't try to explain it. That scared me more than anything. It's been months now. I still drive that road sometimes. I don't know why. Maybe part of me wants proof that it was real. Maybe part of me hopes it'll stop if I face it. The tone hasn't come back as often. The light hasn't appeared in weeks. But every now and then when I'm stopped at a red light late at night, the world goes a little quieter than it should. The air feels thin. The radio hisses faintly, even when it's off. And I keep my eyes forward, waiting for the light to change, telling myself not to look up.